They called him the Devil of Fort Winter, the rancher who wore gloves in summer and turned away every soul who came near. But Elena Price had nowhere left to run, and when she saw that handwritten notice seeking a wife with no questions asked, desperation drowned out fear. What she discovered beneath Rowan Braddock's buttoned coat would change everything she thought she knew about monsters, miracles, and the thin line between damnation and salvation. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Texas sun beat down on Fort Winter like God's own hammer, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat that made the buildings waver like mirages. Elena Price stood outside Murphy's General Store with 53 cents in her pocket, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, and her mother's Bible, and absolutely nowhere to go. The stagecoach that had brought her here from Austin had already disappeared back down the road, leaving her stranded in this frontier town that looked like it had been carved from the desert itself and left to weather into something harder than the stone beneath it. She was 24 years old, orphaned 3 months ago when cholera took both her parents within a week of each other, and she'd spent every dollar she had just getting this far west. The boarding house in Austin had given her 1 week's grace before putting her belongings on the street. She'd answered an advertisement for a seamstress position in Fort Winter, only to arrive and discover the shop had burned down 2 weeks prior, and the owner had moved to California without bothering to inform anyone who might have been traveling to take the job. The store owner, a round-faced man named Murphy with kind eyes and calloused hands, had given her a dipper of water and a sympathetic look when she'd asked about other employment opportunities. "Times are hard, miss," he'd said, wiping down his counter with a rag that had seen better days. "Most folks out here are barely scraping by themselves. The saloon's always looking for girls, but—" He'd trailed off, his meaning clear enough in the apologetic set of his shoulders. Elena had thanked him and stepped back outside, her mind spinning through increasingly desperate options. She could try to work as a laundress, though most families did their own washing. She could offer herself as a governess, though frontier families rarely had money for such luxuries. She could— "Excuse me, miss." A woman's voice, soft and hesitant, made Elena turn. The speaker was perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face lined with the kind of worry that came from carrying other people's burdens. She wore a faded calico dress and an apron dusted with flour. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Mr. Murphy. You're looking for work?" "Yes, ma'am." Elena straightened her spine, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "I'm a capable seamstress, and I can read and write. I'm willing to work hard at whatever needs doing." The woman glanced over her shoulder, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There is one possibility, though I hesitate to mention it. You seem like a decent Christian woman, and I wouldn't want to send you toward—" She paused, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "Well, perhaps you should see for yourself." She gestured toward the store's community board, where various notices were pinned. Advertisements for cattle sales, reward posters for outlaws, announcements of church socials. Among them, written in a bold, angular hand on a piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a ledger book, was a simple notice. "Seeking wife. Must be of good character. Will provide land, shelter, and protection. No questions asked. Inquiries to Rowan Braddock, Braddock Ranch, 5 miles north." Elena read it twice, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. A mail-order bride arrangement wasn't uncommon on the frontier. She'd heard of dozens of women who'd married men they'd never met, traveling west to build new lives. It was practical, if nothing else. A transaction that benefited both parties. "Mr. Braddock has had that notice up for 3 months, the older woman said quietly. "Not a single woman has responded. You should know why before you consider it." "Tell me," Elena said, though part of her wanted to clap her hands over her ears and walk away. But she had 53 cents and nowhere to sleep tonight. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hendricks, the baker's wife, glanced around again before speaking. "Rowan Braddock came to Fort Winter about 5 years ago, bought a big piece of land north of town and set up a cattle ranch. Keeps to himself mostly, comes into town maybe once a month for supplies. But there's something—" She paused, wringing her hands in her apron. "Something wrong about him, miss. He never takes off his coat, even in the middle of summer. wears gloves all the time, never shakes hands, never lets anyone touch him, and his eyes, she shuddered. There's a haunted look in them, like he's seen things that would drive a normal man mad. Perhaps he's just private, Elena offered, though her stomach had tightened into a knot. There's private, and then there's whatever Rowan Braddock is, Mrs. Hendricks said firmly. Last year, Sheriff Collins rode out to his ranch because some cattle had gone missing from a neighboring property. Braddock met him at the property line and told him to turn back. The sheriff insisted on searching the ranch. Whatever Braddock said to him, or showed him, some folks think, made the sheriff ride back to town white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. He resigned his post the next week and moved his family to Colorado. Wouldn't speak a word about what happened out there. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. You think Mr. Braddock is dangerous? I think he's unnatural, Mrs. Hendricks said bluntly. I think there's a reason he never lets anyone close to him, and I think it's a reason no decent woman should investigate. But she softened slightly, her eyes taking in Elena's worn dress and desperate expression. I also know you're in a bad spot, and I won't pretend there are easy answers. I just wanted you to know what you'd be walking into. Elena looked back at the notice, her mind racing. A dangerous man who wore gloves in summer and drove the sheriff away. A ranch 5 miles from town, isolated and remote. A marriage to a stranger who had something so terrible about him that no woman had responded to his offer in 3 months. On the other hand, land, shelter, and protection. No questions asked about her own past, her own desperation, her own lack of options. How would I get to his ranch? She heard herself ask. Mrs. Hendricks sighed, the sound heavy with resignation and perhaps a touch of respect. There's a livery stable at the end of town. Old Tom, who runs it, makes deliveries out to Braddock Ranch every few weeks. He'll be heading out tomorrow morning. I suppose he could take you along if you're determined. I am, Elena said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Hendricks. I appreciate your honesty. The older woman reached out as if to touch Elena's arm, then seemed to think better of it and withdrew her hand. If you change your mind, I can give you a pallet in my kitchen for a few nights while you look for other work. It's not much, but it's safer than— I won't change my mind, Elena interrupted gently. But thank you. You're very kind. She spent that night on Mrs. Hendricks's kitchen floor, lying awake on a thin pallet and staring at the ceiling beams while her mind conjured increasingly horrific explanations for Rowan Braddock's strangeness. Perhaps he was hideously scarred from a fire or an animal attack, too proud to show his disfigurement. Perhaps he was sick with some wasting disease. Perhaps he was simply mad, and the isolation had twisted him into something barely human. Or perhaps, whispered a small, desperate voice in her head, he was just a lonely man who needed help running a ranch and was willing to marry for practical reasons rather than romantic ones. Perhaps the mystery was smaller than the fear surrounding it. She thought of her parents' marriage. Her father had been a bookkeeper, steady and quiet and kind. Her mother had run their home with gentle efficiency, and the two of them had built a life together that was defined more by partnership than passion. They had loved each other, certainly, but it had been the kind of love that grew from mutual respect and daily proximity, not from storybook romance. Perhaps that was all a marriage needed to be. Besides, what choice did she have? She could try her luck at the saloon, surrendering what remained of her dignity for coins pressed into her palm by men who smelled of whiskey and desperation. She could throw herself on the mercy of the church, becoming a permanent charity case for a congregation that had their own struggles to manage. Or she could take a chance on the mysterious Mr. Braddock and see if his demons were ones she could learn to live with. When dawn broke across the Texas sky in shades of pink and gold, Elena was already awake and dressed, her few belongings packed back into her carpet bag. Mrs. Hendricks gave her a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves, for the journey and for after, she'd said meaningfully, and directed her to the livery stable. Old Tom turned out to be a weathered man of indeterminate age, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that had seen enough of life to no longer be surprised by anything. When Elena explained her destination and purpose, he simply grunted, helped her into the supply wagon, and clucked to his horses. They rode in silence for the first mile, the town falling away behind them until there was nothing but scrubland and sky. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, all thorny bushes and hardy grasses, with mountains rising purple in the distance. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. "You sure about this, miss?" Tom finally asked, not looking at her. "No," Elena admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Braddock's not a bad man," he said after another long pause. "Pays his bills on time, treats his horses well, keeps his land in good order, but he's—" Tom searched for words. "He's carrying something heavy, something that's eating him up from the inside. I've been making deliveries to his ranch for 5 years, and I've never once seen him without those gloves and that coat. Never seen him smile, never heard him laugh. Whatever happened to him before he came here, it broke something fundamental." "But he's not cruel?" Elena pressed. "He's not violent?" "Not that I've ever seen. Keeps to himself mostly. Works his land dawn to dusk, takes care of his cattle, doesn't bother anyone." Tom glanced at her sideways. "But that doesn't mean he's safe, miss. Sometimes the most dangerous folks are the ones who are trying real hard not to be dangerous. Like a wild animal that knows it's got rabies and holes up somewhere to die alone so it won't bite anyone." Elena wrapped her arms around herself despite the growing heat of the day. "Do you think I'm making a terrible mistake?" Tom was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I think you're brave and desperate in equal measure, and that's either going to save you or destroy you. I can't tell you which." They lapsed back into silence, and Elena watched the landscape roll past while her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd made her choice. There was no going back now. Braddock Ranch appeared on the horizon like something from a fever dream, a sprawling collection of buildings that included a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and endless fencing that stretched toward the mountains. It was more prosperous than Elena had expected, well-maintained and substantial. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and she could see a vegetable garden beside the house, the plants growing in neat, orderly rows. As Tom's wagon rolled up the long dirt drive, a man emerged from the barn. Even at a distance, Elena could see that he was tall, well over 6 feet, and built with the kind of lean muscle that came from hard physical labor. He wore dark trousers, heavy boots, and a long duster coat that hung to his knees despite the heat. His hands were covered in leather gloves. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Afternoon, Braddock. Got your usual supplies in the back, plus a passenger." The man, Rowan Braddock, Elena's potential husband, approached slowly. As he drew near, Elena could finally see his face beneath the hat's brim, and her breath caught. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 or 31, with strong features that might have been handsome if they weren't carved into an expression of such profound wariness. His jaw was shadowed with stubble, and his eyes, dark blue, almost gray, held exactly the haunted quality Mrs. Hendricks had described. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and survived when perhaps they shouldn't have. Those eyes focused on Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You're here about the notice," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, as if he didn't use it often, but it carried clearly in the desert air. "I am." Elena lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm Elena Price. I've come to discuss your offer of marriage." Something flickered across Braddock's face, surprise, maybe, or disbelief. Up close, she could see tension in every line of his body, as if he were constantly braced for a blow that might come from any direction. "You sure about that?" he asked, echoing Tom's earlier question. "The town must have told you stories." "They told me you're dangerous and strange," Elena said bluntly. "They told me you drove the sheriff away and that you never take off your coat or gloves. They told me no decent woman should come out here." "They're right," Braddock said flatly. "You should go back to town." "I have nowhere to go back to," Elena replied, surprising herself with her honesty. "I'm alone in the world, Mr. Braddock. I have no family, no prospects, and less than $1 to my name. Your notice said you needed a wife and could provide shelter and protection. I need exactly what you're offering, so unless you're going to turn me away, I suggest we discuss terms." Braddock stared at her for a long moment, and Elena had the strange sensation of being evaluated by someone who understood desperation intimately. Then he turned to Tom. "Help her down and bring the supplies to the porch. I need to talk to Miss Price alone." Tom shot Elena a look that might have been concern or admiration, she couldn't tell which, but he helped her down from the wagon and began unloading crates and sacks. Braddock gestured toward the house. "We'll talk inside," he said, already walking toward the door without checking to see if she followed. Elena grabbed her carpet bag and hurried after him, her heart racing. The house's interior was surprisingly neat and well kept. A large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything had the slightly unlived-in quality of a space maintained by someone who doesn't quite feel at home in it. Braddock stood in the center of the room, still wearing his coat and gloves, and gestured toward one of the wooden chairs near the table. "Sit." Elena sat, placing her bag at her feet, and waited. Braddock didn't sit. Instead, he paced to the window and looked out at his land, his back to her. "I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to," he said without preamble. "This wouldn't be a normal marriage. I need someone to help run the household, to handle the domestic work I don't have time for. In return, you'd have a home, food, protection, and half of whatever profit the ranch makes. But there are rules." "What rules?" Elena asked, her mouth dry. Braddock turned to face her, and the intensity of his gaze made her want to look away. "First, you never try to touch me. Not casually, not intentionally, not ever. I don't shake hands. I don't have physical contact with people. That's non-negotiable." Elena nodded slowly. "All right, what else?" "Second, you don't ask questions about my past or about why I am the way I am. What I choose to tell you is my decision, but you don't pry." "Understood." "Third, we'd have separate sleeping arrangements. I'll build an addition to the house, or I'll sleep in the barn. I can't share a bed with anyone." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. "Mr. Braddock, are you saying this would be a marriage in name only?" "I'm saying I can't be what most women want in a husband," Braddock said, his voice dropping to something almost painful to hear. "I can't give you children or affection or any of the normal things that come with marriage. All I can give you is security and a roof over your head. If that's not enough, then you should leave now, and I'll pay Tom to take you back to town." Elena sat very still, processing this. A marriage without intimacy, without touch, without the possibility of children or the kind of partnership her parents had shared. It should have horrified her. It should have sent her running back to the wagon. Instead, she found herself asking, "Why do you need a wife at all, if you want to live like a hermit?" Braddock's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Because I'm tired of being completely alone," he said. "Because even though there are things I can't do or be, I still want another human being around. Someone to talk to occasionally, someone to share meals with, someone who makes this place feel less like a prison." Is that selfish? Probably, but it's the truth. The rawness in his voice made something in Elena's chest tighten. She recognized that loneliness, had felt it herself in the weeks since her parents' deaths, that crushing isolation that made you feel like you were disappearing from the world one piece at a time. "I'll do it," she heard herself say. "I'll marry you, Mr. Braddock, under your terms." His eyes widened. "You don't have to decide right now. Take a few days, think about—" "I don't need a few days," Elena interrupted. "I need exactly what you're offering: shelter, security, and a purpose. I don't need romance or passion. I need to survive. So if you're serious about this arrangement, then so am I." Braddock stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Price." "Probably both," Elena admitted, "but I'm also decided. When did you want to marry?" He blinked, seeming genuinely thrown by her directness. The courthouse in town handles civil ceremonies. We could go tomorrow if you're certain." "Tomorrow is fine." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment, two desperate people who had just agreed to legally bind their lives together without anything approaching normal courtship or romance. It should have been absurd. It probably was absurd, but Elena had learned that survival often looked absurd from the outside. "I'll show you to the spare bedroom," Braddock finally said, heading toward one of the doors. "You can settle in today, and we'll head to town first thing in the morning." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the vegetable garden. Elena set her carpet bag down and turned to find Braddock still standing in the doorway, as if afraid to come any closer. "Thank you," she said softly. I know this arrangement is strange, but I'll do my best to be useful. Something in Braddock's expression shifted, not quite softening, but losing some of its harsh edges. I'm the one who should be thanking you, he said. You're either going to think you've made the biggest mistake of your life, or... He trailed off, shaking his head. I'll leave you to get settled. Dinner's at sunset. He turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back at her, he said quietly, For what it's worth, Miss Price, I promise I'll never hurt you. Whatever else I am, I'm not cruel. And I won't let anyone else hurt you either. Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor as he left the house entirely, probably heading back to whatever work he'd been doing when they arrived. Elena sank onto the bed and let out a shaky breath. She'd done it. She'd committed to marrying a man she'd met less than an hour ago, a man with secrets dark enough to scare away the sheriff, a man who couldn't or wouldn't touch another human being. Either she'd just saved her own life, or she'd walked willingly into a nightmare. Tomorrow, she would find out which. That evening, Elena sat across from Rowan Braddock at his kitchen table and ate a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. He'd cooked it himself, competently, if not elaborately, and had served her portion before taking his own seat as far from her as the table allowed. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the whisper of wind against the house. Elena studied him covertly, noting the way he kept his gloves on even while eating, the careful way he held himself as if any relaxation might be dangerous. How long have you been running the ranch alone? She finally asked. 5 years, Braddock said, his voice rough from disuse. Built most of it myself. It's impressive. The land, the buildings, the cattle. You've done well. He shrugged, the gesture dismissive. It's something to do. Keeps me occupied. Elena hesitated, then ventured, You don't have to treat me like I'm made of glass, Mr. Braddock. I know the rules you laid out, and I'll respect them, but we're going to be living in the same house. We might as well learn to have a conversation. Braddock looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face again. Most people are afraid to talk to me. Most people haven't agreed to marry you, Elena pointed out. If I'm going to be your wife, even in the limited sense you've defined, then I need to be able to speak to you without you looking like you're waiting for me to run away screaming. The ghost of something that might have been a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Fair enough. What do you want to know? What do you do with your time besides work? I read, he said. I have books, and He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've been teaching myself to control certain abilities, things I need to master. Elena's curiosity sharpened, but she remembered his second rule about not asking questions. Instead, she said, I like to read too. My father was a bookkeeper, and he taught me to love books. What do you read? Everything, Braddock admitted. Philosophy, science, history, anything that helps me understand how the world works, how things fit together. They talked cautiously for another hour, trading basic information about their pasts, her childhood in Austin, her parents' deaths, his arrival in Texas 5 years ago. He didn't offer details about what came before that arrival, and Elena didn't push. When the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Braddock stood. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, he said. You can have the house. Mr. Braddock, Rowan, he interrupted. If we're getting married tomorrow, you should probably call me Rowan. Rowan, Elena repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. You don't have to sleep in the barn. I won't bother you if you want to stay in your own room. I know, he said quietly. But I need space sometimes. The barn's comfortable enough. I'll see you at dawn. He left before she could protest further, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Elena cleaned up the dinner dishes, exploring the kitchen and taking stock of what supplies the household had. Tomorrow would bring a wedding and a permanent commitment to this strange new life. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something that might have been cautious hope. Perhaps they could make this work after all. The courthouse in Fort Winter was a squat adobe building that looked like it had been built to withstand both desert storms and the weight of frontier justice. Elena stood on its steps at 8 o'clock the following morning, her best dress, A simple gray cotton that had belonged to her mother, smoothed down as much as possible after its time in the carpet bag. Beside her, Rowan Braddock stood rigid in his long coat and gloves, his hat pulled low over his eyes, looking like a man attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. Judge Morrison, a portly man with magnificent white whiskers and kind eyes, had agreed to perform the ceremony with minimal fuss. He'd seen enough frontier marriages to know better than to ask uncomfortable questions about why the groom wore gloves indoors, or why the bride and groom stood 3 feet apart from each other. "Do you, Rowan Braddock, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man who'd performed this ceremony dozens of times. "I do," Rowan said, his voice steady despite the tension Elena could see in his shoulders. "And do you, Elena Price, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elena looked at Rowan, this strange, haunted man who had offered her salvation in exchange for nothing more than companionship and discretion. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I pronounce you man and wife." Morrison closed his book and smiled at them. "You may kiss the bride." The silence that followed was excruciating. Rowan went absolutely still, and Elena saw something like panic flash across his face before he mastered it. "We'll skip that part," she said quickly, saving them both. "Thank you, Judge Morrison." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, but he simply nodded and handed Rowan the marriage certificate. "Congratulations to you both. May you find happiness together." They signed the register, Rowan's handwriting bold and angular, Elena's more delicate, and walked back out into the morning sunlight as husband and wife. Tom was waiting with the wagon to take them back to the ranch, and Mrs. Hendricks stood nearby with a basket. "I baked you a wedding cake," the older woman said, pressing the basket into Elena's hands. Her eyes were sad and worried. I hope you'll be happy, dear." "Thank you," Elena said, meaning it. "Your kindness has meant more than you know." The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride into town had been. Tom kept his eyes on the road. Rowan stared at the horizon as if it held answers he desperately needed, and Elena clutched the basket of wedding cake and wondered what exactly she'd just done. When they arrived back at the ranch, Rowan helped unload the few supplies they'd purchased in town, carefully avoiding any possibility of his hands touching Elena's, and then stood awkwardly in the yard as if unsure what to do next. "I should get back to work," he finally said. "The cattle need checking, and there's fence that needs mending in the north pasture." "All right," Elena replied. "I'll start getting familiar with the house. Figure out what needs doing." Rowan nodded and turned toward the barn, then paused. "Elena," he said, her name sounding strange in his rough voice. "Thank you for going through with this. I know I'm asking a lot." "We're asking a lot of each other," Elena corrected gently. "But we'll figure it out." He looked like he wanted to say something more, but instead he just nodded again and walked away, his long coat swirling around his legs. Elena watched him disappear into the barn and then carried the basket into the house that was now, legally speaking, her home. Over the following days, they developed a careful rhythm. Rowan rose before dawn and worked the ranch until exhaustion drove him to stop, mending fences, tending cattle, maintaining buildings, doing the endless labor that kept a property this size running. Elena took over the household duties, cooking meals that Rowan ate quickly and silently, washing clothes that he left in a basket by the back door, cleaning rooms that already seemed obsessively neat. They barely spoke beyond practical necessities. "Dinner's ready." "Thank you." "I'm going to town for supplies tomorrow." "I'll make a list." The house felt less like a home and more like a way station where two strangers happened to sleep under the same roof. Elena tried not to feel hurt by the distance. This was what she'd agreed to, after all. But there was something profoundly lonely about living with another person who kept himself so completely walled off. At least when she'd been alone in Austin, her solitude had been honest. This was a different kind of isolation, the kind that came from being near someone who refused to be reached. She learned Rowan's patterns through observation. He never removed his coat or gloves, even when working in the brutal Texas heat. He avoided being indoors during the day when possible, as if the walls pressed too close. He rarely slept more than a few hours, and when he did, it was in the barn, not the house. Sometimes she'd hear him moving around in the middle of the night, pacing, restless, like something caged. 3 weeks into their marriage, Elena woke to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed her shawl and hurried into the main room to find one of the kitchen windows shattered, a large rock on the floor amid the glass shards. Rowan stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, the first time she'd seen him without his coat, staring at the damage with an expression of pure rage. "Stay back," he said sharply when Elena moved to help clean up. "There's glass everywhere." But Elena had already seen what he didn't want her to see. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and even in the dim pre-dawn light, she could see marks on his forearms. Not scars exactly, but something else. Lines that looked almost like writing, flowing symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly silver against his skin. Rowan caught her staring and immediately yanked his sleeves down, his face going white. "I told you not to come in here?" "Someone threw a rock through our window," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. "Who did this?" "Probably kids from town, testing whether the stories are true." Rowan's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "It happens sometimes. They dare each other to come out here, throw things, try to get a reaction." "That's horrible," Elena said. "You should tell the sheriff." "Oh, wait." She remembered that the sheriff had fled after encountering whatever Rowan kept hidden. "What exactly did you show Sheriff Collins that made him leave town?" Rowan's jaw clenched. "That's the kind of question you promised not to ask." "I promised not to pry into your past," Elena countered. "But this is affecting our present. Someone just vandalized our home. I think I have a right to understand why." They stood on opposite sides of the glass-strewn kitchen, the broken window letting in the cool morning air, and Elena saw Rowan wrestling with something. Fear and anger and something else, maybe a desperate kind of longing to tell the truth. "If I show you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you'll leave. Everyone leaves." "I'm your wife," Elena said. "Legally bound to you. I have nowhere else to go, remember? And I'm not some easily frightened girl. I've seen death and poverty and desperation. Whatever you're hiding can't be worse than what I've already survived." Rowan laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "You'd be surprised." But he rolled up his left sleeve anyway, slowly, revealing the full extent of the markings Elena had glimpsed earlier. They covered his entire forearm in intricate patterns that looked like a cross between writing and artwork, symbols she didn't recognize, flowing into each other in designs that seemed to move slightly when she looked at them directly. They were beautiful and unsettling in equal measure, glowing with that faint silver luminescence that seemed to come from beneath his skin rather than on it. "They go everywhere," Rowan said, his voice empty of emotion. "My arms, my chest, my back, my legs. Every inch of me marked with symbols I didn't choose and don't fully understand." Elena stepped closer, carefully avoiding the broken glass, drawn by horrified fascination. "How did this happen?" 6 years ago, I was working on a cattle drive in northern Mexico," Rowan said, staring at his own arm as if it belonged to someone else. "We got separated from the main group during a storm, and I took shelter in what I thought was an abandoned mission. It wasn't abandoned. There was a sect there, people who practiced old magic, the kind that predates Christianity in that region. They were..." He paused, struggling for words. "They were trying to bind elemental power to human vessels, fire, water, earth, air. They needed test subjects." Elena felt cold despite the warm morning air creeping through the broken window. "They did this to you against your will?" "They did it to 5 of us," Rowan said. "The other 4 didn't survive the process. I was the only one who lived through the ritual. These marks, they're not tattoos. They're channels carved into my flesh and filled with something they called stormlight, power drawn from the elements themselves and bound to my body." "What does it do?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. Rowan finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes made her chest ache. "It makes me dangerous. When storms come, real storms, with lightning, the power activates and I lose control. I've knocked men unconscious without touching them. I've made objects fly across rooms, and I can't..." His voice broke. "I can't touch people. The power that runs through me is always there, always active at a low level. If I make skin-to-skin contact with someone, it hurts them. Not much, like grabbing something hot, but enough. That's why I wear the gloves and the coat. That's why I can't be normal. Elena absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with everything she knew about the world. Magic wasn't real. Power drawn from elements was superstition. But the marks on Rowan's arms were undeniably real, glowing faintly in the growing dawn light, and the conviction in his voice was absolute. "Show me," she said. "What?" "Show me what you can do. Prove it to me." Rowan shook his head violently. "No, I told you I hurt people. I'm not demonstrating this on you." "Then demonstrate it on something else," Elena insisted. "If you want me to understand, truly understand, then show me." Rowan stared at her for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen table. He removed his left glove. Elena could see his hand shaking, and held his bare palm several inches above the wooden surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the silver marks on his arm began to glow brighter, and the table started to vibrate. Not much, just a slight tremor, but enough to make the salt shaker rattle. Rowan pulled his hand away, and the vibration stopped immediately. "That's nothing compared to what happens during a storm," he said, quickly pulling his glove back on. "During lightning storms, the power surges. I can barely control it. 3 years ago, during a bad storm, He stopped, his face going gray. "There were men staying in my barn, ranch hands looking for work. When the storm hit, I lost control. The power erupted from me like an explosion. 2 of them died, just stopped breathing like their hearts gave out. The third was Sheriff Collins's brother. He survived, but his hands were burned so badly he couldn't use them for months. That's what I showed Sheriff Collins when he came demanding answers. I showed him exactly what I am, and he ran." Elena felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. 2 men dead because Rowan had lost control of power he never asked for. No wonder he isolated himself. No wonder he lived in constant fear. "The sect that did this," she said carefully, "where are they now?" "Dead as far as I know," Rowan said. "Mexican authorities raided the mission a few months after what happened to me. The sect members fought back and most were killed. A few escaped, including the one who performed the ritual on me. I've spent years trying to find any information about how to remove these marks, but there's nothing. No books, no records, no one who understands what was done to me." "And you've lived with this alone for 6 years," Elena said softly. "Because no one else should have to live with it," Rowan replied fiercely. "This is my curse, my burden. That's why I sleep in the barn. If a storm hits, I won't hurt you. That's why I can't touch you. That's why I can't be a real husband. I'm a monster pretending to be a man." Elena looked at him, at this broken, lonely person who was trying so desperately to protect everyone around him that he'd exiled himself from human connection entirely, and felt something shift in her chest. "You're not a monster," she said firmly. "You're a victim. There's a difference." "Tell that to the men who died," Rowan said bitterly. "I can't, because they're dead. But I can tell you that their deaths weren't murder. They were tragedy. You didn't choose this power, you didn't want it, and you've spent 6 years trying to protect people from it. That's not what monsters do." Rowan looked at her with something like desperate hope warring with disbelief on his face. "How can you say that? You barely know me." "I know that you offered marriage to a stranger because you were tired of being alone," Elena said. "I know that you've been careful and respectful of boundaries, even though it must be lonely beyond measure. I know that you work yourself to exhaustion trying to control something you never should have had forced upon you. That tells me who you are, Rowan, and that person isn't a monster." For a moment, she thought he might cry. His eyes went bright and his jaw trembled, and he looked younger than his years, like a boy who'd been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "I don't deserve your kindness," he whispered. "That's not your decision to make," Elena replied. "Now help me clean up this glass, and we'll figure out how to keep the town kids from harassing us." They worked together in silence, Rowan sweeping up the larger shards while Elena collected the smaller pieces. The sun rose fully as they worked, painting the kitchen in golden light that made the whole incident feel almost dreamlike. When they were finished and Rowan had nailed boards over the broken window as a temporary fix, Elena made coffee and they sat at the table together, the closest they'd been since their wedding day. "Thank you," Rowan said, wrapping his gloved hands around his coffee cup. "For not running, for not being afraid." "Oh, I'm afraid?" Elena admitted. What you showed me is terrifying, but I'm not afraid of you. There's a difference. Something in Rowan's posture relaxed slightly, as if he'd been holding himself rigid for years and was finally allowing himself to breathe. What do we do now? Now we replace that window and we keep living, Elena said. And maybe we try to actually talk to each other occasionally. We're married, Rowan. We don't have to be friends, but we could at least try to be partners. I'd like that, Rowan said quietly. I'd like that a lot. Things changed after that morning. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in small, incremental ways that accumulated into something meaningful. Rowan still slept in the barn, but he started joining Elena for breakfast instead of grabbing food on his way out. They talked while they ate, tentative conversations at first, then gradually more comfortable. He told her about the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd, about the small frustrations and victories of working the land. She told him about her parents, about the books she'd loved as a child, about the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher. Elena started leaving things for him. A coat she'd mended without being asked, a lunch packed for days when he'd be working far pastures, a book she thought he might enjoy placed on his workshop table in the barn. Rowan, in turn, began small gestures of his own. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door. He brought her wildflowers from the far fields, awkwardly presenting them without explanation. He carved her a better clothespin holder when he noticed hers was falling apart. They were building something, Elena realized. Not romance, not passion, but something perhaps more rare. Genuine partnership founded on honesty and mutual respect. They were two damaged people learning to exist in the same space without hurting each other, and there was a quiet beauty in that. 6 weeks after their wedding, Elena was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She turned to see 3 riders coming up the drive, rough-looking men with hard eyes and guns on their hips. Fear spiked through her, but before she could run to the house, Rowan appeared from the barn, moving to intercept them. "This is private property," Rowan called out, his voice carrying clear authority. "State your business or turn around." The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Heard you got yourself a wife, Braddock. Wanted to see if she was as desperate as the rumors say." Elena saw Rowan's hands clench into fists, saw the tension that meant he was fighting for control. She moved before she could think better of it, walking to stand beside her husband even though fear made her legs weak. "I'm Elena Braddock," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And yes, I'm Rowan's wife. Now, unless you have legitimate business here, I suggest you leave before we have a problem." The scarred man laughed. "You hear that, boys? Little lady's got spirit. Wonder how long that'll last once she figures out what she married into." "One more word," Rowan said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, "and you'll regret it." "You threatening us, Braddock?" The man's hand drifted toward his gun. "Because I don't think you want to do that. We know what you are. We know about Mexico. Be a shame if word got out that there's a killer living among decent folks." Elena felt Rowan go absolutely rigid beside her. The air itself seemed to change, taking on a quality she couldn't name, like the pressure before a storm. The marks beneath his clothes must be glowing, she realized. He was losing control. "Rowan," she said quietly, urgently. "Don't. They're not worth it." "Listen to your wife," the scarred man taunted. "Keep your devil tricks to yourself." But Elena saw what the riders didn't. Clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with rain. A storm was coming, and if it arrived while Rowan was already agitated, while he was already fighting for control, the results could be catastrophic. "Get off our land," she said, putting every ounce of authority she could muster into her voice. "Right now, or I'll ride to town and tell everyone there that you were harassing a married woman on her own property. I don't care what rumors you've heard about my husband. Harassment is harassment, and I have witnesses." She gestured vaguely toward the barn, bluffing about whether anyone else was present. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, but apparently Elena's threat carried weight. He sneered at them both, but he wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over, Braddock. Sooner or later, folks are going to want answers about what you really are." They rode away in a cloud of dust, and Elena watched them disappear before turning to Rowan. He was shaking, his breathing ragged, and she could see silver light flickering beneath his shirt. "Inside," she said. "Now, before the storm hits." Rowan let her guide him to the house, which was remarkable in itself. He never let anyone this close, never accepted help. But he was clearly losing the battle for control, and when thunder rumbled in the distance, he made a sound of pure pain. "You need to leave," he gasped as they reached the house. "Get to town. Stay with Mrs. Hendricks. This is going to be bad." "I'm not leaving you," Elena said firmly. She'd seen enough now to understand what was coming, Rowan writhing in agony while power he couldn't control surged through him, alone and terrified in his own barn. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to help." "You can't," Rowan said, but his voice was weakening. "No one can. Just stay away from me." The storm rolled in fast, the way desert storms did, bringing wind that howled around the house and rain that lashed against the windows. Lightning cracked across the sky, and Rowan collapsed to his knees with a cry of agony. Elena watched in horror as the marks on his arms began glowing through his shirt, bright silver light that pulsed with each lightning strike. "Rowan," she said helplessly, wanting to touch him, to comfort him, but knowing she couldn't. The air around him was practically crackling with energy now, and she could feel the hair on her arms standing on end. "Get back," Rowan groaned, curling in on himself. "Please, Elena, I don't want to hurt you." But watching him suffer alone felt impossible. They'd built something together over these weeks. Not love, maybe, but trust. Partnership. The beginning of genuine care. She couldn't just stand here and do nothing. Lightning struck somewhere close, probably one of the fence posts, and Rowan screamed. The silver marks were blazing now, visible even through his clothes, and objects around the room started to shake. A tin cup flew off the table and clattered against the wall. The windows rattled in their frames. Elena made a decision that was either very brave or very stupid. She dropped to her knees beside Rowan, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her presence, and started talking. "Listen to my voice," she said, making her tone as calm and steady as possible, even though her heart was racing. "You're not in Mexico. You're home. You're safe. This storm will pass, just like all the others have. You've survived this before, Rowan. You can survive it again." "Can't," he gasped. "Too strong. Going to lose control." "No," Elena said firmly. "No, you're not. Because I'm here, and I'm not going to let you. You're stronger than this power, Rowan. You've been fighting it for 6 years, and you're still fighting. Don't stop now." She kept talking, kept her voice steady, kept herself present without touching. And slowly, so slowly, she saw Rowan's breathing begin to even out. The silver glow didn't fade, but it stopped growing brighter. The shaking object settled. He was still clearly in pain, still struggling, but he wasn't losing control. "That's it," Elena encouraged. "You're doing it. Stay with me. Focus on my voice, not the storm." Thunder crashed overhead, and Rowan flinched but didn't scream. His hands were braced against the floor, gloved fingers digging into the wood, and Elena could see him fighting with everything he had to stay present, stay controlled. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, grasping for anything that might help. "Tell me about your plans for the cattle." "What?" Rowan's voice was strangled. "Your plans," Elena repeated. "You said you wanted to expand the herd. Tell me how you're going to do it." For a moment she thought he wouldn't be able to answer, that the pain was too great. But then, haltingly, he started talking. His voice was rough and broken, but he described his breeding plans, the pastures he wanted to improve, the fence repairs that needed doing. And as he talked, as he focused on something concrete and familiar, Elena watched the silver glow begin to fade. The storm raged for another hour, but Rowan made it through without losing control. By the time the lightning passed and the rain softened to a gentle patter, he was exhausted and shaking but coherent. He looked up at Elena with something like awe. "You stayed," he said. "Why did you stay?" "Because you're my husband," Elena said simply. "And because no one should have to face their demons alone." Rowan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I could have killed you." "But you didn't. You stayed in control because you're stronger than you believe." Elena sat back on her heels, giving him space. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," Rowan admitted. "But I'm all right. Because you were here. I've never When storms hit, I always lose control completely, but you somehow helped me stay present. Maybe you just needed someone to anchor you, Elena suggested. Someone to remind you who you are when the power tries to make you forget. They sat there on the floor together as the storm moved on, not touching, but closer than they'd ever been. And Elena realized that their strange marriage was becoming something neither of them had expected, a genuine connection forged in honesty and sustained by mutual need. "Thank you," Rowan said finally. "I don't have words for what you just did, but thank you." "We're partners," Elena replied. "That's what you do for your partner." Something in Rowan's expression shifted, softened in a way she'd never seen before. "Elena," he said hesitantly, Would you stay in this house tonight? Not in my room, but just here? I don't want to be alone." It was the first time he'd ever asked for her presence instead of maintaining distance. Elena felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Of course," she said. "I'll stay." That night, Rowan slept on the floor near the fireplace while Elena stayed in her bedroom with the door open. It wasn't much. They were still in separate spaces, still maintaining boundaries, but it felt like a beginning. The beginning of trust becoming something deeper, loneliness transforming into companionship. Neither of them could have known that this was just the calm before a different kind of storm, one that would bring revelations about Rowan's past and force them both to confront questions about what it meant to be human, to be powerful, and to choose love in a world that feared what it didn't understand. But for now, in the quiet after the storm, two people who had married as strangers rested easier knowing they weren't completely alone anymore. The weeks following that storm marked a subtle but undeniable shift in the rhythm of their lives. Rowan still maintained his boundaries, still wore his coat and gloves like armor against the world, but there was a softness to him now that hadn't existed before. He smiled occasionally, rare, fleeting expressions that transformed his haunted face into something almost boyish. He laughed once when Elena told him a story about her father's disastrous attempt to learn horseback riding, and the sound was so unexpected and genuine that they'd both fallen silent afterward, surprised by the normalcy of it. Elena found herself watching him more openly now, no longer pretending disinterest. She noticed how he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, how his hands were surprisingly gentle when working with the horses, how he sometimes stood at the edge of his property at sunset and stared toward the mountains as if searching for something he'd lost. She noticed, too, the nights when he couldn't sleep, when she'd hear him pacing in the barn or working by lamplight into the small hours, driven by demons she was only beginning to understand. 2 months after their wedding, on a brutally hot afternoon in late August, Elena was preparing dinner when Rowan came through the door moving stiffly, his face pale beneath its tan. She looked up from the potatoes she was peeling and immediately set down her knife. "What happened?" she asked, taking in the way he was favoring his left side. "Nothing," Rowan said, but his voice was tight with pain. "Just a fence post that fell the wrong way. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You can barely stand up straight." Elena wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward him. "Let me see." "No," Rowan said sharply, backing away. "It's just bruised. I'll be all right by morning." But when he tried to remove his coat, he sucked in a sharp breath and couldn't complete the motion. Elena watched him struggle for a moment, watched pride war with practicality on his face, and then made a decision. "Sit down," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. "Right now, Rowan, if you've cracked a rib or done serious damage, you need to know. And since you won't let a doctor near you, for obvious reasons, I'm the only option you have." Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but another wave of pain must have convinced him because he slowly lowered himself into one of the kitchen chairs. "You can't touch me," he reminded her. "The marks—" "I know," Elena interrupted. "I'll be careful, but I need to at least look at the injury. Can you remove your coat?" With visible effort and several pauses to breathe through the pain, Rowan managed to shrug out of his long coat. Beneath it, he wore a work shirt, and Elena could see a dark stain spreading across the left side. Not a bruise showing through fabric, actual blood. "Rowan," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "That's not just a bruise. You're bleeding." "The fence post had a nail," he admitted reluctantly. "It caught me when it fell. I thought it was just a scratch." "A scratch doesn't bleed through your shirt." Elena grabbed clean towels from the cupboard and set them on the table. You need to take off your shirt so I can see how bad it is. Rowan's face went even paler, but this time it wasn't from pain. Elena, I can't. The marks. You've seen my arms, but the rest is worse. I don't want you to see. I don't care about the marks, Elena said firmly. I care about whether you're going to bleed out in my kitchen because you're too proud to accept help. Now either you remove that shirt or I'll cut it off with my sewing scissors. For a long moment they stared at each other, wills clashing. Then Rowan's shoulders sagged in defeat. Turn around, he said quietly. Please, just give me a moment. Elena turned to face the window, giving him privacy, and heard the rustle of fabric as he removed his shirt. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. You can look now. She turned back and felt her breath catch. The marks on his arms had been shocking enough, but seeing the full extent of what had been done to him was something else entirely. The silver symbols covered every inch of his torso, spreading across his chest and shoulders, flowing down his sides, wrapping around his back in intricate patterns that seemed to pulse faintly with their own light. They were beautiful in a terrible way, like someone had turned his body into an unwilling canvas for art that was never meant to exist. But Elena forced herself to look past the marks to the injury itself. A deep gash along his left ribs, still bleeding sluggishly, surrounded by already darkening bruises. It needed stitching, and soon. This is bad, she said, keeping her voice clinical, even though her hands wanted to shake. It needs to be cleaned and closed. I've helped my mother stitch wounds before. Nothing this deep, but I know the basics. Do you have medical supplies? Barn, Rowan said, not meeting her eyes. There's a kit in the tack room. Elena ran to get it, her mind racing. When she returned, Rowan was sitting exactly as she'd left him, staring at his own marked hands as if they belonged to a stranger. She set the kit on the table and began laying out what she'd need. Thread, needle, clean cloth, whiskey for sterilization. This is going to hurt, she warned. I'll be as gentle as I can, but I know, Rowan said. Just do what needs doing. Elena poured whiskey over the wound, and Rowan hissed in pain but didn't pull away. She worked as carefully as possible, cleaning the gash and preparing to stitch. The marks surrounding the injury glowed slightly brighter as she worked, responding to his pain or perhaps to her proximity, but they didn't seem to be causing any immediate danger. Why do they glow brighter sometimes? She asked, trying to distract him as she began the first stitch. Rowan's jaw clenched, but he answered. They respond to emotion, fear, anger, pain. Anything intense makes them activate. During storms, the activation is involuntary and overwhelming. The rest of the time, I can usually keep them suppressed, but it takes constant effort. That must be exhausting, Elena said, pulling the thread through and starting the next stitch, living every moment trying to control something that shouldn't be inside you. You have no idea, Rowan said, and there was such profound weariness in his voice that Elena's heart ached. Sometimes I dream about what it would be like to just let go, stop fighting, but I can't. The moment I stop trying to control it, people get hurt. Elena worked in silence for a moment, focusing on making each stitch neat and even despite her trembling hands. She was acutely aware of how close she was to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his marked skin, close enough to see the way the silver patterns seemed to flow like water beneath the surface, close enough to touch, if she dared. Have you ever tried to understand the marks? She asked. To learn what they say or mean? They're not any language I recognize, Rowan replied. I've looked through every book I could find on ancient languages, tribal symbols, religious iconography. Nothing matches. It's like whoever carved these into me invented their own system, or drew from something so old it's been forgotten. The sect members who survived, Elena said carefully, starting another stitch. Did you ever try to find them, to force them to explain? Rowan was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I spent 2 years tracking down every lead, chasing every rumor. Found one of them in a village near Guatemala. He laughed when he saw me, said I should feel honored to be chosen as a vessel for divine power. When I demanded he remove the marks, he said it was impossible, that the ritual binds the power to the soul, not just the body. Removing the marks would mean removing my life along with them. Elena's hands stilled. That can't be true. There has to be a way. Maybe, Rowan said, but I never got to ask him anything else. The villagers found out what he was, what his sect had done. They killed him before I could stop them, beat him to death in the street while I watched. I'm sorry, Elena said softly, resuming her stitching. I'm not, Rowan said, and there was something dark in his voice. He deserved worse for what he did to me and the others, but his death meant losing the only person who might have had answers. After that, I gave up searching, came to Texas, bought this land, tried to build something resembling a life while keeping everyone at a safe distance. Elena tied off the last stitch and stepped back to examine her work. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. The wound would heal, given time and care. Until I showed up and wouldn't stay at a safe distance, she said. Rowan finally looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Until you showed up and somehow weren't afraid of me, he said. Do you know how rare that is, Elena, to have someone see the worst of what I am and not run? I see someone dealt a terrible hand who's doing his best with it, Elena replied. That's not the worst of what you are, Rowan. That's evidence of your strength. She reached for the bandages to wrap his ribs, and as she moved closer, Rowan suddenly went rigid. Don't, he said sharply. I can do the rest myself. Don't be ridiculous. You can barely move without pain. Let me... No, Rowan said, and there was real fear in his voice now. Elena, I'm not wearing gloves. If you touch me, even accidentally, you'll get hurt. Please, just let me do this part. Elena looked at him, at this man who had suffered so much and carried such burdens alone, and made a choice that was either inspired or insane. She picked up a bandage roll and held it out to him, letting it dangle from her hand and then deliberately let it slip from her fingers. Rowan's instinct was faster than his fear. His hand shot out to catch the falling bandage, and his bare fingers brushed against Elena's palm. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Elena waited for the burning sensation Rowan had described, for pain or shock or some sign that his power was hurting her. But there was nothing, just the warmth of his skin against hers, rough with calluses and completely, utterly normal. Rowan stared at their touching hands as if witnessing a miracle. You're not hurt, he breathed. Why aren't you hurt? Elena was just as stunned, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she carefully wrapped her fingers around his, maintaining the contact, and watched his face cycle through disbelief, hope, and something that looked dangerously close to joy. I don't know, she admitted, but I'm not. I don't feel anything except you. Rowan's other hand came up slowly, trembling, and touched her arm, bare skin against bare skin where her sleeve had rolled back. Still nothing, no pain, no burning, just contact. Human touch that he'd been denied for 6 years suddenly possible again, and the expression on his face was so vulnerable it made Elena want to cry. How is this possible? Rowan whispered, and she could see tears tracking down his face now. Elena, how are you touching me? I don't know, she said again. Maybe whatever power is in you recognizes that I'm not a threat. Or maybe it's because we're connected now through marriage, or maybe... She didn't get to finish because Rowan pulled her into his arms, wrapping her in an embrace that was desperate and gentle at the same time. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she felt his whole body shaking, 6 years of isolation and touch starvation breaking like a dam. Elena held him carefully, mindful of his injured ribs, and let him have this moment of overwhelming relief. I'm sorry, Rowan gasped after a long moment, starting to pull back. I shouldn't have... Don't you dare apologize, Elena said fiercely, tightening her hold. Don't you dare. After everything you've endured, you're allowed to accept comfort when it's offered. They stood like that for several minutes, Rowan slowly coming back to himself while Elena provided the anchor he so desperately needed. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer than she'd ever seen them. Thank you, he said hoarsely. I don't have words for what this means. To be able to touch someone without hurting them. To touch you. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks at the way he said you, with such profound gratitude and something else she wasn't ready to name. We should finish bandaging your ribs, she said, trying to ground them both back in practicality. And you need to rest. That injury is serious. Rowan nodded, but he was looking at his hands like they were new to him, flexing his fingers and staring at the marks that covered them. 6 years, he said wonderingly. 6 years of not being able to touch anyone. And suddenly, with you, it's possible. There has to be a reason. Maybe the reason doesn't matter as much as the fact itself, Elena suggested, carefully wrapping the bandage around his torso. She tried to ignore how intimate this felt, her hands on his bare, marked skin, the warmth of him beneath her fingers. Maybe sometimes miracles happen without explanations. Or curses find their exceptions, Rowan countered, but there was no bitterness in his voice now. Just wonder. They finished the bandaging in silence, and Elena helped Rowan into a clean shirt, the marks still visible in flashes as the fabric moved over them. He was exhausted from the injury and the emotional weight of what had just happened, and Elena insisted he rest on the settee in the main room rather than trying to make it to the barn. "Stay," he said as she turned to leave him to sleep. "Please, just sit with me for a while." So Elena pulled a chair close and sat, and Rowan reached out to take her hand, marveling at the simple act of holding someone's hand without gloves between them, and fell asleep like that. Elena watched him rest, his face finally peaceful, and tried to process what had happened. The marks on his body held power that hurt others, but somehow didn't hurt her. It was impossible, illogical, and yet undeniably real. She thought about what Rowan had said, that the ritual bound power to the soul. Perhaps that meant the power itself had some kind of consciousness or instinct. Perhaps it could distinguish between threat and safety, between stranger and what? Wife? Partner? Something more? Elena didn't know, but as she sat there holding the hand of the man she'd married out of desperation and necessity, she realized their arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. This wasn't just a practical marriage anymore. This was two people genuinely beginning to care for each other, building connection in the spaces between loneliness and hope. She fell asleep in the chair, their hands still joined, and when she woke several hours later to find Rowan watching her with an expression of such tender gratitude, she knew with absolute certainty that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. Over the following days, they explored this new possibility with the tentative wonder of children discovering something precious. Rowan could touch Elena's hand, her arm, her shoulder. Any contact they tested resulted in nothing but normal human warmth. It was only with Elena, they discovered. When old Tom came by with supplies and Rowan forgot himself enough to help unload without gloves, the old man yelped and pulled back from even the briefest contact, complaining of a sharp burning sensation. "It's specifically you," Rowan said that evening as they sat together after dinner, his bare hand resting on the table next to hers. Not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "No one else, just you." "Does that frighten you?" Elena asked. Rowan considered the question seriously. "It should," he admitted. "It's another variable in a situation I don't understand and can't control. But honestly, it feels more like hope than fear. Like maybe I'm not completely cursed. Like maybe there's a reason you came to this ranch when you did." "Fate," Elena suggested with a small smile. "I don't know if I believe in fate," Rowan said, "but I believe in you. In this, whatever this is becoming." Elena felt something flutter in her chest at those words. Their marriage had started as a transaction, but somewhere along the way it had become something real. She cared about this damaged, complicated man who was trying so hard to be more than his worst moments. She cared about his pain and his hope, and the way he looked at her like she was the first good thing that had happened to him in years. "I believe in it too," she said quietly, and finally closed the small distance between their hands, linking her fingers with his. They sat like that as the sun set, two people learning to trust in impossible things. But the world had a way of intruding on private miracles, and 3 weeks later, that intrusion came in the form of hoofbeats and official voices demanding attention. Elena was collecting eggs from the chicken coop when she heard the riders approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast, and when she straightened to look, her heart sank. 6 men, all armed, led by a 7th wearing a badge that caught the afternoon light, a federal marshal, and behind him, men who had the hard look of either deputies or hired guns. Rowan emerged from the barn, and Elena saw him assess the situation in an instant. His face went carefully blank, but she could see tension locking his shoulders, could see the way his hands, bare now when they were alone on the property, clenched into fists. "Rowan Braddock?" the marshal called out, his voice carrying clear authority. He was a lean man with gray hair and cold eyes, someone who'd spent a lifetime enforcing laws in hard places. "That's me," Rowan said, positioning himself between the riders and Elena. "What's this about?" The marshal dismounted, his men following suit, creating a semicircle that was clearly designed to intimidate. "I'm Federal Marshal Davis Warren. I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the deaths of 2 men near Chihuahua, Mexico, in 1872. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The ranch hands who had died during the storm, the incident that had driven Sheriff Collins away. They'd finally come for Rowan, and they'd brought enough men to ensure he couldn't refuse. "Those deaths were accidental," Rowan said, his voice steady despite the fear Elena could see in his eyes. "I had no control over what happened." "That's for a judge to decide," Warren replied. "But there are witnesses who say you used unnatural abilities to kill those men, that you're some kind of witch or demon. Mexican authorities want you extradited to stand trial." "The Mexican authorities raided the people responsible for those abilities and killed most of them," Rowan countered. "They know what was done to me wasn't my choice." "Then you'll have no problem explaining that to a judge," Warren said, but his hand was drifting toward his gun. "Now, you can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Elena saw Rowan's jaw clench, saw the silver marks on his arms beginning to glow beneath his shirt. He was trapped. If he resisted, he'd be proving their accusations about being dangerous. If he went quietly, he'd likely be hanged based on testimony from people who feared what they didn't understand. Either way, he was looking at death. "Give us a moment," Elena said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. She moved to Rowan's side, deliberately taking his hand. "My husband deserves a chance to say goodbye to his wife before you take him away." Warren's eyes narrowed at their joined hands, at the fact that Elena was touching Rowan's bare skin without flinching. "You sure you want to be touching him, ma'am? Word is he burns anyone he makes contact with." "Word is often wrong," Elena replied coolly. "And I'm not asking permission, Marshal. I'm informing you of what's happening. Give us 2 minutes." Warren hesitated, then nodded curtly. 2 minutes. My men will be watching." Elena pulled Rowan toward the house, feeling him trembling beneath her touch. Once inside, she turned to face him and saw barely controlled panic in his eyes. "They're going to kill me," he said flatly. "If not here, then in Mexico. There's no trial that ends with me walking free." "Then don't let them take you," Elena said urgently. "Fight. I've seen what you can do." "I can't," Rowan said desperately. "Don't you understand? If I use the power against them, I'm confirming everything they're afraid of. I become the monster they think I am. And even if I could bring myself to hurt them, which I can't, Elena, I swore I'd never use this power to harm anyone again. What then? I'd be a fugitive forever. They'd hunt me to the ends of the earth." "So what's the alternative?" Elena demanded. "You just surrender? Let them hang you for something that wasn't your fault?" Rowan cupped her face in his hands, a gesture that would have been impossible just weeks ago, and the intimacy of it made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "The alternative is that you stay here and run this ranch, that you live the life we were starting to build, that you—" "No," Elena said fiercely. "No, I won't accept that. We'll figure something out. We'll find a lawyer. We'll present evidence. We'll—" The door burst open and 2 of Warren's men entered, guns drawn. "Time's up," one of them said. "Braddock, you need to come now." Rowan looked at Elena one last time, his eyes full of 100 things he didn't have time to say. Then he turned to face the deputies. "I'm coming. Don't point those guns at my wife." They walked outside to where Warren and the rest of the men waited. The marshal had handcuffs ready, heavy iron that looked like they'd been designed for dangerous prisoners. And as he approached Rowan, Elena saw her husband's whole body tense. "Those won't be necessary," Rowan said. "I'm not resisting." "Can't take that chance," Warren replied, reaching for Rowan's wrists. The moment the iron touched Rowan's skin, everything went wrong. The marks on his arms blazed suddenly brilliant, light pouring through his shirt like lightning contained in flesh. Rowan screamed, not in anger but in agony, and the power that he'd been suppressing for weeks erupted outward in a wave of invisible force. The deputies were thrown backward as if struck by a massive hand. Horses reared and screamed. Warren was knocked flat on his back, the handcuffs clattering from his grip. And Rowan stood at the center of it all, his body lit from within with silver fire, clearly fighting for control but losing the battle. "Stop!" Elena shouted, running toward him even though everyone else was scrambling away. "Rowan, stop! You're doing exactly what they want you to do." But Rowan couldn't hear her over the roar of power in his own ears. The marks were fully activated now, responding to his fear and pain, and Elena could see objects around the yard beginning to levitate. Fence posts pulling from the ground, tools floating from the barn, even small stones rising into the air like the property itself was defying gravity. Warren's men had drawn their guns, and Elena saw with horror that they were aiming at Rowan. They were going to shoot him, would claim self-defense, and there would be no trial at all. "No!" Elena threw herself in front of Rowan, spreading her arms wide to shield him. "Don't shoot! He's not trying to hurt anyone. The power is reacting to the iron. It's the metal that's triggering this." "Get out of the way, ma'am!" Warren shouted, scrambling to his feet. "That thing is dangerous." "He's not a thing, he's a person," Elena shouted back. "And he's my husband. I won't let you murder him because you're too ignorant to understand what was done to him." Behind her, she could feel Rowan struggling, could hear him gasping for air as he fought to suppress the power that wanted to destroy everything around him. She turned to look at him and saw agony written across every line of his face. The silver light was so bright now it was painful to look at directly, and she could feel heat radiating from his body. "Listen to me," she said urgently, taking his face in her hands the way he'd done for her earlier. His skin was burning hot but didn't hurt her, never hurt her, and she used that connection to try to reach him. "Rowan, come back to me. Find control. You've done it before during storms. You can do it now." "Can't," Rowan gasped, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Too much. The iron, it amplifies everything. I'm going to kill them." "No, you're not," Elena said firmly. "Because I'm right here, and I'm not letting you. You're not a killer, Rowan Braddock. You're a good man dealt a terrible fate. Now prove it. Show them that you're stronger than this power." For a moment she thought it was too late, that he was too far gone. But then Rowan's eyes focused on her face, really focused, and she saw him grabbing onto her presence like a lifeline. The blazing silver light began to dim. The floating objects started to sink back to earth. The pressure in the air that had been building toward explosion slowly released. It took several minutes where Elena held Rowan's face and kept talking to him in a low, steady voice, reminding him who he was and where he was. Gradually, painstakingly, he pulled the power back under control. The marks still glowed beneath his clothes, but the light was fading, returning to the suppressed state he normally maintained. When Rowan finally sagged forward, exhausted, Elena caught him and held him upright. She turned to face Warren and his men, all of whom looked pale and shaken. "You see?" she said, her voice ringing with challenge. "He could have killed all of you. The power wanted to. But he didn't let it, because he's not the monster you think he is." Warren stood slowly, his hand still on his gun, clearly not sure whether to be impressed or terrified. "That just proves he's dangerous," he said. "Maybe more dangerous than we thought. We're taking him in." "You can't," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see two riders approaching from the direction of town. People Elena hadn't noticed in all the chaos. As they drew closer, she felt Rowan stiffen in her arms. The newcomers were a man and a woman, both dressed in traveling clothes, both with the kind of weathered faces that spoke of hard living. And when they dismounted, Elena saw with shock that the man's hands bore the same silver markings that covered Rowan's body. The woman had them too, visible on her neck and disappearing under her collar. "Who the hell are you?" Warren demanded, his patience clearly exhausted. The marked man smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression. "We're people like him," he said, nodding toward Rowan. "Survivors of the same sect, same ritual. And we're here to tell you that Rowan Braddock isn't guilty of murder. He's a victim who is fighting back against the people who did this to him." The silence that followed stretched like wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Elena felt Rowan go rigid against her, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he stared at the two marked strangers who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. The woman was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and eyes that held the same haunted quality as Rowan's. The man was younger, maybe 35, with broad shoulders and hands that trembled slightly as they hung at his sides, hands covered in those same impossible silver symbols. Marshal Warren recovered first, his hand tightening on his gun even as confusion clouded his features. "I don't care who you claim to be," he said, his voice hard. "I have a warrant for Rowan Braddock's arrest, and I'm executing it. The rest of you need to step aside before I charge you with obstruction." "You can't arrest a man for defending himself," the marked woman said, her voice carrying an authority that made even Warren hesitate. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a thick envelope, its seal already broken. "This is a gubernatorial pardon for Rowan Braddock, signed by the governor of Texas 3 days ago. We've been riding hard to get here before you did, Marshal, but it seems we only just made it." Warren's face darkened with suspicion. "That's impossible. I received my orders from officials who didn't know the full story," the woman interrupted. She walked forward, holding out the envelope. "Read it yourself. Rowan Braddock is not guilty of murder. The men who died at his ranch were members of the sect that marked him, sent to recapture him and finish what they'd started. He fought back, and the power he can't fully control killed them. Self-defense, Marshal, not murder." Elena felt the world tilt sideways. "That's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rowan told me they were ranch hands looking for work, that he lost control during a storm, and that's what he believed," the marked man said gently, looking at Rowan with something like pity. "That's what they wanted him to believe. But we've spent the last 4 years tracking down every member of that sect we could find, piecing together what really happened. Those men were sent specifically to your ranch, Rowan. They drugged your water supply to weaken your control, then waited for a storm to trigger a full manifestation. They were going to take you back to whatever hole they'd crawled into and use you for their rituals again." Rowan made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, hollow and broken. "You're saying I didn't kill innocent men?" "You killed men who were trying to kidnap and torture you," the woman said firmly. "Men who were complicit in everything that sect did. Sheriff Collins's brother was one of them. That's why the sheriff ran. He knew his brother was involved with dark magic and didn't want anyone looking too closely at the family connections." Warren was reading the pardon now, his expression shifting from suspicion to reluctant acceptance. "This has the governor's seal," he admitted, "and it's countersigned by a federal judge in Austin, but that doesn't explain why you two are here or why you care about Braddock." The marked woman smiled, though there was no humor in it. "My name is Sarah Blackwood. This is James Chen. We were marked by the same sect, same ritual, but we escaped before they could complete their plans for us. We've been hunting down the remaining sect members ever since, trying to free others who were taken and gathering evidence about what was done to us. When we heard a federal marshal had been dispatched to arrest Rowan, we knew we had to intervene." "There are more of you?" Elena asked, her mind struggling to process this flood of new information. "More people marked like Rowan?" "7 that we know of," James said. 3 of the others didn't survive long after the marking. The power consumed them before they learned control. But there are 4 of us now, including Rowan, who've managed to survive and build some kind of life." Sarah stepped closer to where Elena still held Rowan, close enough that Elena could see the marks on her neck pulsing faintly with silver light. "We heard rumors about you months ago," she said to Rowan. "A man in Texas with storm powers who never showed his skin. We've been trying to find you for 2 years, but you covered your tracks well." "I wasn't trying to be found," Rowan said, his voice raw. "I was trying to disappear." "We know," James said. "We all felt that way at first, but Sarah and I learned that isolation makes the power stronger. Having connections, having people who understand what you're carrying, that makes control possible. That's why we came. To tell you you're not alone, and to help you master what's inside you before it destroys you." Warren cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "This pardon says Braddock's cleared of all charges related to the deaths in 72, he said slowly, "and it orders me to provide protection if needed, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be protecting him from at this point." "From the 3 sect members we know are still alive," Sarah said bluntly. They've been careful, staying hidden, but we have reason to believe they're planning something. The ritual they performed on us was supposed to create vessels for elemental gods. That was their theology, anyway. They think if they can gather all the marked ones and complete some kind of final ceremony, they can achieve immortality or divine power or whatever insanity they believe in. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard, Warren said flatly. And I've heard some crazy things in my time as a lawman. It doesn't matter if it's crazy, James countered. What matters is they believe it, and they've already proven they're willing to kidnap and torture people to make it happen. Rowan's not safe as long as they're alive. None of us are. Elena felt Rowan's weight shifting as he straightened, finding his strength despite the exhaustion that had nearly dropped him moments ago. Why now? He asked Sarah and James. Why show up today specifically? Because one of the surviving sect members was spotted in San Antonio 2 weeks ago, Sarah said grimly. A man named Castellan, their former high priest. We think he's tracking you, and when we heard the marshal had been dispatched, we feared it might be a setup, that Castellan had somehow influenced the warrant to flush you out or get you into a vulnerable position. Warren's face darkened at the suggestion that he might be an unwitting pawn in someone else's game. I received my orders through proper channels, he said defensively. Federal judge in Austin, like I said. And how did that judge hear about the case? Sarah asked. Who brought it to his attention after all these years? Warren opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly running through the chain of events that had led him here. Anonymous tip, he finally admitted. Letter with detailed information about Braddock's location and the incident in 72, signed by someone claiming to be a witness. Castellan, James said with certainty. He was trying to force Rowan into a confrontation where he'd have to use his powers in front of authorities, probably hoping he'd be killed in the process. The sect spent years trying to eliminate the vessels they can't control or recapture. This is all very interesting, Warren said, his patience clearly wearing thin. But I need something more than stories about cults and magic to justify what just happened here. I have deputies who were thrown through the air by invisible force, and I need to know whether Braddock's a danger to the public. He's not, Elena said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. He spent 6 years learning control, never hurting anyone except in self-defense, keeping himself isolated to protect others. If anyone's a danger, it's the people who did this to him. Sarah looked at Elena with something like approval. You must be the wife. We heard rumors about that too, that Braddock had married, which seemed impossible given his condition. How long have you been able to touch him? About 3 weeks, Elena admitted. We don't know why I'm immune when everyone else gets burned. Sarah and James exchanged a long look, and Elena saw something pass between them, knowledge they weren't sure whether to share. Finally, Sarah spoke carefully. The ritual that marks us binds elemental power to our souls, but it also creates something like a resonance. Each marked vessel responds to different triggers, different emotional frequencies. For some of us, anger amplifies the power. For others, fear. But there's a theory, and it's only a theory, that love might be able to ground it instead of amplifying it. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Love. Elena felt heat rise to her face, and beside her, Rowan had gone very still. They'd never discussed feelings, never labeled what was growing between them as anything beyond partnership and friendship. That's speculation, James said quickly. We don't know for certain, but Sarah and I have been together for 3 years now, and I can touch her without pain. The same is true for Marcus and his partner in Colorado. It might be coincidence, or it might be that deep emotional bonds somehow alter the way the power interacts with others. So you're saying Elena can touch me because Rowan trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. I'm saying there's a connection between you that's affecting how the power behaves, Sarah said diplomatically. What you call that connection is your business. Warren had clearly had enough of metaphysical discussions. Here's what's going to happen, he said in a tone that brooked no argument. I'm accepting this pardon as legitimate, which means Braddock's free to go, but I'm also filing a report with the Federal Marshal Service about what I witnessed here today, and I'm recommending that someone keep an eye on this situation. If these cult members you're talking about are real threats, that's something the authorities need to know about. The authorities wouldn't believe you if you told them, Sarah said bluntly. We've tried reporting what we know. Most lawmen think we're insane. The smart ones quietly suggest we leave town before we cause trouble. Then maybe it's time people started believing, Warren countered. I saw what Braddock did. Saw things floating in the air. Saw men knocked down by nothing visible. That's not something I can just ignore and pretend never happened. What are you suggesting? Rowan asked warily. Warren looked at him for a long moment, and Elena saw the marshal wrestling with his own understanding of the world. I'm suggesting that maybe you folks should stay together, he finally said. If there are really only 4 of you left alive, and if there are people hunting you, then spreading out makes you vulnerable. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start defending yourselves properly. That's exactly what we've been trying to convince the others to do, James said, with evident satisfaction. But Marcus in Colorado won't leave his homestead, and Catherine in New Mexico insists she's safer alone. Maybe if they see that Rowan's found a way to have a real life despite the marking, they'll reconsider. We're not inviting them here, Rowan said quickly, alarm flashing across his face. This ranch is Elena's home too, and I won't turn it into a fortress or a gathering place for people like you? Sarah interrupted gently. People who understand what you're carrying? Rowan, you've been alone with this for 6 years. Don't you think it might help to have others around who can teach you better control? Who can warn you about the dangers you don't know exist yet? She's right, Elena said quietly, and Rowan turned to look at her with surprise. I know you've worked hard to build something here, to have a place that's safe and separate. But Rowan, these people are offering you knowledge and community. They're offering to help you become more than what the sect wanted you to be. That's worth considering, isn't it? Rowan looked torn, clearly wanting to maintain the life he'd built, but also hungry for the understanding and support Sarah and James represented. Before he could answer, one of Warren's deputies called out from where he'd been examining the perimeter of the property. Marshal, you need to see this! The group moved to where the deputy stood pointing at the ground near the fence line. Deep in the dust were boot prints, lots of them, recent enough that they hadn't been disturbed by wind. Someone had been watching the ranch, and recently. Could be those kids from town who threw the rock, one of the other deputies suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah knelt beside the prints, her face grave. These are adult boot prints, and they're spaced wrong for casual observation. Whoever made these was watching the house for extended periods. And look here. She pointed to a disturbed area where someone had clearly knelt or crouched. This is a surveillance position. Professional, not pranksters. Castellan, James said grimly. He's been here watching, probably waiting for the right moment to make his move. Warren's hand went to his gun again, this time in genuine alarm rather than suspicion. You're saying there might be a dangerous cult member in the area right now? I'm saying we need to be careful, Sarah replied, standing and scanning the horizon. Castellan's smart and patient. He won't attack directly unless he's certain of success. But if he's been watching the ranch, he knows about Elena now. Knows she's a vulnerability he could exploit. Elena felt cold despite the afternoon heat. The thought of being watched by someone who saw her as nothing more than leverage to use against Rowan was deeply unsettling. Rowan moved closer to her, his protective instincts clearly overriding everything else. Then we need to find him before he makes his move, Rowan said, his voice hard with determination. Where would he hide? Where would you look if you were hunting cult members? Old missions, abandoned homesteads, anywhere isolated where strange activities wouldn't attract attention, James said. We've been checking those places throughout Texas for weeks, but it's a big territory and we're only 2 people. 3 people now, Rowan corrected. If you're serious about helping me learn control and hunting these bastards down, then I'm with you. But Elena stays protected. Whatever happens, she doesn't become collateral damage in this. Excuse me, Elena said sharply, but I think I should have some say in decisions about my safety and my life. I'm not some delicate flower that needs to be locked away, Rowan. I know that, Rowan said, turning to face her. But Elena, you've already been dragged into more than you bargained for when you answered that marriage notice. I won't let you be hurt because of what I am. What you are is my husband, Elena said firmly. And that means we face dangers together, not with you trying to shield me from everything difficult. I've learned about your power. I've seen you at your worst and helped you through it. Don't push me away now because you're afraid. Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She's right, you know. The marked ones who've survived longest are the ones who've had partners supporting them. Marcus has his wife helping run his homestead and watching his back. Catherine survived an assassination attempt because her brother was there to help her fight off the attackers. Isolation doesn't protect the people we love. It just makes us weaker when threats finally come. Listen to them, Elena urged. I'm not asking to go hunting cult members with you, but I am asking to be part of the decisions, to understand what's happening. This is my home now too, Rowan. My life. Let me help protect it. Before Rowan could respond, Warren cleared his throat. Much as I hate to interrupt what's clearly an important domestic discussion, I need to finish my job here. Braddock, you're officially cleared of all charges. These two, he gestured at Sarah and James, seem to be legitimate, and their story checks out as much as any crazy story can check out. But I'm going to need statements from all of you for my report, and I'm stationing 2 of my deputies in Fort Winter for the next few weeks, just in case this Castellan character really is in the area. Thank you, Marshal, Rowan said, offering his hand before remembering himself and pulling back. Sorry, can't shake hands. Warren looked at the offered and withdrawn hand, then at Elena standing close to Rowan, then at Sarah and James with their visible marks. This is the strangest case I've ever worked, he said finally. And I once tracked a man who claimed to be a werewolf. Turned out he just had a lot of body hair and poor judgment. He shook his head. I'll send word to the other territorial marshals about the cult threat. Maybe someone else has seen something. In the meantime, you folks watch yourselves. The marshal and his men packed up and rode out as the sun began to set, leaving Rowan, Elena, Sarah, and James standing in the yard amid the debris of the confrontation. Elena could feel exhaustion pulling at her, the emotional weight of the day combining with the physical demands of treating Rowan's injury and standing against armed lawmen. But there were still things that needed to be discussed, questions that needed answers. Come inside, she said, making the decision for all of them. We should talk properly, and I need to check Rowan's stitches after all that exertion. They settled in the main room, Elena insisting on examining Rowan's ribs before allowing any further conversation. The wound had held together despite his loss of control, though the surrounding bruising looked worse. She rebandaged it carefully while Sarah and James watched with interest. You're good at that, Sarah observed. Medical training? Just experience helping my mother tend to neighbors, Elena replied. Nothing formal, but I've learned quickly since marrying Rowan, he seems determined to injure himself with concerning regularity. That's the power, James said. It makes us restless, drives us to push our physical limits. I spent my first year after marking barely sleeping, working until I collapsed, trying to exhaust the energy before it could build up. Didn't really work, but I couldn't stop trying. Is that why Rowan works from dawn to dusk? Elena asked, securing the bandage and helping Rowan back into his shirt, noting that he no longer tried to hide the marks from her, though he was still self-conscious about Sarah and James seeing them. Probably, Sarah confirmed. Sarah. The power needs an outlet. For James, it's physical labor. For me, it's making things. I do carpentry work, spend hours building and fixing. Marcus writes compulsively, thousands of pages trying to understand what was done to us. Catherine paints. We all find ways to channel the energy so it doesn't consume us. Rowan settled back into his chair, looking exhausted but more at peace than Elena had seen him in days. Tell me about control, he said to Sarah and James. Tell me what you've learned that I don't know. So they talked late into the night, Sarah and James sharing years of hard-won knowledge about the power that bound them. They explained how different emotional states triggered different manifestations, how anger made the power aggressive and violent, fear made it defensive and unpredictable, but calm focus could shape it into something almost useful. They taught Rowan meditation techniques that helped suppress the baseline hum of energy, breathing exercises that created a buffer between stimulus and response. The key is accepting that the power is part of you now, James explained. Not fighting it like an enemy, but acknowledging it like a limb you didn't have before. When you resist it constantly, when you try to pretend it doesn't exist, that's when it breaks through your control in dangerous ways. But if you acknowledge it, work with it, you can direct it instead of being directed by it. That sounds dangerous, Rowan said. Accepting this thing that was forced into me feels like surrendering to what they wanted. It's not surrender, Sarah corrected. It's reclaiming agency. They wanted us to be vessels, passive containers for their power. Learning to actively control and direct what they put in us, that's the opposite of what they intended. That's us becoming more than they ever planned for. Elena listened, absorbing information that should have been impossible but was undeniably real. She learned that storms triggered the power because lightning was essentially elemental electricity, and the marks responded to any form of raw energy. She learned that iron, suppressed and amplified simultaneously, contained the power while also causing it pain, which was why Rowan had lost control when Warren tried to put handcuffs on him. She learned that the marks couldn't be removed because they'd been carved too deep, integrated with nerves and blood vessels in ways that made them as fundamental as his heart or lungs. But they can be trained, James said. The marks respond to repeated patterns like muscle memory. If you practice controlled releases in safe environments, you can teach your body to default to control instead of chaos. Show me, Rowan said. James stood and moved to the center of the room, rolling up his sleeves to expose marks similar to Rowan's but with different patterns. Watch, he said, and closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the marks on James's arms began to glow softly, not the blazing light of loss of control, but a steady, manageable luminescence. The air around him shimmered slightly, and Elena felt a breeze start to circulate through the room, despite all the windows being closed. It was gentle, controlled, almost peaceful. "A moving air," James explained, his voice calm despite the obvious concentration on his face. "Not a lot, not violently, just enough to practice directing the power instead of suppressing it. When I first started learning this, I could barely manage a few seconds before losing control. Now I can maintain it for hours if needed." The breeze faded, and James's marks dimmed back to their baseline glow. He opened his eyes and smiled at Rowan's stunned expression. "You could learn to do the same. All of us can, with practice. Sarah's even better at it than I am. She can reshape metal without touching it, move objects with precision, all because she spent years training instead of just suppressing." "I don't know if I can do that," Rowan said quietly. "Every time I let the power out even a little, people get hurt." "Because you've only ever lost control, never practiced control," Sarah said gently, "and because you've been doing it alone." "But you're not alone anymore, Rowan. We can help you practice safely, give you feedback, teach you the techniques that have worked for us. It won't be easy, and it won't be fast, but it's possible." Elena saw hope and fear warring on Rowan's face. The possibility of mastering the power that had controlled him for 6 years was clearly tempting, but the risk of hurting someone during practice was equally terrifying. She reached out and took his hand, offering silent support. "I'll help too," she said. "However I can." Rowan looked at their joined hands, then at Sarah and James, then back at Elena. "All right," he finally said. "Teach me. Help me become more than a prisoner of this thing inside me." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely pleased. "That's what we were hoping you'd say. James and I have been traveling for 2 years, gathering the marked ones, building a network. We can't undo what was done to us, but we can learn to live with it, maybe even use it for something good." "What did you have in mind?" Elena asked. "The sect has been kidnapping people for decades," Sarah said grimly. "Not just for marking rituals, but for other purposes too. Forced labor, human sacrifice, who knows what else. We found evidence of at least 15 people who disappeared in regions where the sect operated. Most are probably dead, but some might still be captive. We want to find them, free them, and then hunt down every last cult member until this nightmare is over." "That's ambitious," Rowan said, "and dangerous." "Everything about our existence is dangerous," James countered. "At least this way we're being dangerous in a direction that matters." They talked until exhaustion finally pulled them all toward sleep. Sarah and James accepted the spare bedroom, leaving Rowan and Elena standing in the main room as the first light of dawn began creeping through the windows. Neither of them had slept, and the emotional toll of the last 24 hours was written clearly on both their faces. "I can't believe this is real," Rowan said quietly, "that there are others like me, that there might be a way to actually control this instead of just surviving it." "Are you glad they came?" Elena asked. Rowan considered the question seriously. "Yes," he finally said. "Terrified, but glad. For 6 years I thought I was alone with this curse. Now I find out there's a whole network of people fighting to reclaim their lives from the same people who destroyed mine. It's overwhelming, but in a good way, maybe. Elena moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible months ago, but now felt natural. You don't have to decide everything tonight, she said. Sarah and James aren't going anywhere immediately. We have time to figure out what comes next. I know, Rowan said, wrapping his arm around her carefully, still marveling at the simple fact that he could hold her without causing pain. But I think I've already decided. I want to learn control. I want to help find the people the sect has taken. And I want... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. I want to be worthy of what you've given me, Elena. The trust, the partnership, the fact that you can touch me when no one else can. I want to be someone you can be proud of. Elena pulled back slightly so she could look up at his face. I'm already proud of you, she said softly. You've survived things that would have broken most people. You've built a life despite impossible circumstances. And you've been kind to me when you had every reason to be bitter and closed off. That's more than enough, Rowan. Something in his expression shifted, becoming tender in a way that made Elena's heart skip. When Sarah talked about emotional bonds changing how the power works, he said carefully, she used the word love. And I realized that somewhere between you arriving desperate and terrified and now He stopped, took a breath, started again. I've fallen in love with you, Elena. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you stood between me and Warren's guns. Maybe when you held my hand through that first storm. Maybe it's been building since you first agreed to this crazy arrangement. But it's true. And I thought you should know. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of hearing those words. I love you too, she said, and watched wonder bloom across Rowan's face. I think I started loving you the day you told me about the marks, when you were so afraid I'd leave but brave enough to be honest anyway. And it grew every day after that, watching you fight to be good despite everything trying to make you feel like a monster. Rowan pulled her close again, holding her like she was something precious and fragile despite knowing she was neither. They stood like that as the sun rose, two people who had found each other in darkness learning to stand together in the light. Outside, the ranch was waking up, birds singing, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the world continuing its eternal cycle. Inside, two damaged souls were becoming something whole, but neither of them could know that in an abandoned mission 30 miles south, Castellan was watching them through a scrying mirror, his ancient face twisted with rage at seeing his prize vessel slipping beyond his reach, already planning the violence that would bring Rowan Braddock back under his control or destroy him entirely. The peace they'd found was real, but it was also temporary. The real storm was still coming. The next 3 weeks brought a transformation to Braddock Ranch that would have seemed impossible just months before. Sarah and James stayed, turning the barn into a makeshift training ground where Rowan spent hours each day learning to consciously direct the power that had controlled him for so long. Elena watched from the house as he practiced releasing small amounts of energy in controlled bursts, watched him fail and rage and try again with the stubborn determination of a man who'd spent 6 years as a prisoner finally seeing the bars of his cage. On the 4th day of training, Rowan managed to levitate a small stone for nearly 30 seconds before his concentration broke and it clattered to the ground. He'd looked at Elena with such joy and disbelief that she'd run to him and thrown her arms around him, both of them laughing like children who'd discovered something miraculous. It was a small victory, but it was his victory, proof that he could be more than a victim of the power inside him. Marcus arrived from Colorado on the 10th day, a quiet man with scholar's hands and eyes that had seen too much. His marks were on his back and chest, hidden beneath layers of clothing, and he brought with him journals filled with research about the sect's history and theology. He and Rowan spent long evenings poring over the texts, searching for any weakness they could exploit, any knowledge that might help them understand what had been done to them. Catherine came 3 days later, fierce and sharp-edged, her marks visible on her face and neck like war paint she'd stopped trying to hide. She was the best of them at combat applications of the power, having spent years defending herself from assassination attempts. She taught Rowan how to create barriers of compressed air, how to redirect attacks, how to sense danger before it manifested. Elena found her intimidating at first, but Catherine softened around the edges when she saw how devoted Rowan and Elena were to each other. "You're good for him," Catherine told Elena one afternoon while they prepared dinner together. "I can see the difference it makes, having someone who sees past the marks to the person underneath. Marcus has that with his wife, and it saved him. You're saving Rowan the same way." "He's saving me too," Elena replied, slicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. "I was alone and desperate when I came here. He gave me a home and a purpose. We're saving each other." Catherine smiled, a rare expression that transformed her scarred face into something almost gentle. "That's the best kind of saving." But even as the household found its rhythm, even as Rowan grew stronger and more confident in his control, there was an undercurrent of tension that none of them could quite shake. The boot prints near the fence line hadn't reappeared, but that absence felt more ominous than comforting. Castellan was out there somewhere, watching and waiting, and the question wasn't if he would strike, but when. The answer came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Sarah and James's arrival. Elena was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Not the measured pace of a casual visitor, but the desperate speed of someone fleeing. She turned to see a rider she didn't recognize pulling up to the house, his horse lathered with sweat and wild-eyed. "Need to speak to Braddock," the man gasped, sliding from his saddle. "Now, it's urgent." Rowan emerged from the barn with Sarah and James flanking him, immediately on alert. "I'm Braddock. What's happened?" The rider was one of Marshal Warren's deputies, Elena realized, a young man named Peters who'd been stationed in Fort Winter to watch for cult activity. His face was pale and his hand shook as he pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "The marshal's been taken," Peters said, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. 3 men ambushed him on the road to Austin yesterday. They left this note pinned to a tree where we'd find it. Rowan took the paper and unfolded it, his face going hard as stone as he read. Sarah looked over his shoulder and cursed softly. Without a word, Rowan handed the note to Elena. The handwriting was elegant and precise, almost beautiful, which made the words themselves more disturbing. "Rowan Braddock, you have something that belongs to me. 6 years ago you fled before our great work could be completed, robbing us of our most promising vessel. Now you've gathered others of our marked ones around you, playing at being something other than what you truly are. This ends now. I have your Marshal Warren and will exchange him for you, alone, unarmed, and willing. Come to the San Felipe Mission ruins at sunset tomorrow. Bring any of your new companions, and the Marshal dies. Attempt to resist, and he dies. You know what I'm capable of, Rowan. I carved those marks into your flesh myself. I can remove them just as easily, though the process will destroy you. The choice is yours. Surrender yourself for proper completion of the ritual, or carry the Marshal's death along with all the others you've caused. I'll be waiting. Castellan. Elena felt ice flood her veins. This was it. The confrontation they'd all been dreading, framed in exactly the way that would make Rowan most vulnerable. Appeal to his guilt, threaten an innocent life, demand he face the nightmare alone. It was perfectly calculated to exploit every weakness Rowan had. You can't go, she said immediately. It's obviously a trap. Of course it's a trap, Rowan replied, his voice eerily calm. But he has Warren, and Warren was only there because of me. I can't let him die because I'm afraid. This is exactly what Castellan wants, James said urgently. He's trying to separate you from the people who can help you. If you go alone, he'll complete whatever ritual he has planned, and we'll lose you. And if I don't go, he kills Warren and probably comes after Elena next, Rowan countered. I won't risk her. I won't risk any of you. So your plan is to just surrender? Catherine demanded, having emerged from the house at the commotion. Let them finish what they started 6 years ago? Rowan, you're better than that. You're stronger than that now. I'm not strong enough to face a master ritualist who literally created the power inside me, Rowan said flatly. None of us are. Castellan's had decades to perfect his craft. We've had weeks of practice. Then we get more help, Marcus suggested. We contact the territorial marshals, the rangers, anyone with authority who might believe us. There's no time, Sarah said grimly. Sunset tomorrow gives us maybe 30 hours. Even if we could convince someone in authority to help, they couldn't mobilize fast enough. And honestly, what would we tell them? That a cult leader who can work magic has kidnapped a federal marshal and wants to complete a ritual on our marked friend? They'd lock us up for being insane. Deputy Peters cleared his throat nervously. The other deputies and I could help, he offered. Marshal Warren took a chance believing your story. We're willing to do the same. We may not understand all this magic business, but we know how to handle armed men. How many deputies? Catherine asked, her tactical mind clearly calculating odds. 4 counting me, Peters said. Not much, but we're all decent shots. Against Castellan? That won't be enough, Sarah said. He's trained in combat magic specifically designed to counter mundane weapons. Bullets won't reach him if he's prepared. Then we don't fight him with bullets, Rowan said, and Elena heard something shift in his voice, determination replacing resignation. We fight him with the same power he gave us. We use what we've learned, work together, and we end this. Not with surrender, but with resistance. Now that's the spirit, Catherine said with grim satisfaction. What did you have in mind? They spent the rest of the day planning, spreading maps of the San Felipe mission ruins across the kitchen table and arguing strategies. The mission had been abandoned for decades, its adobe walls crumbling back into the desert, but Marcus's research revealed it had been one of the sect's original gathering places. Castellan choosing it for the confrontation was symbolic. He wanted to complete Rowan's transformation where the sect's power had first taken root in Texas soil. He'll have prepared the site, Marcus warned, pointing to the mission's layout. Ritual circles, protective wards, probably trapped approaches. Walking in blind would be suicide. So we don't walk in blind, Elena said, surprising everyone by speaking up. We scout it first, today, before sunset. See what he's set up and plan accordingly. That's dangerous, Rowan said immediately. If Castellan's there already. He won't be, Catherine interrupted. He's too theatrical for that. He'll arrive exactly at sunset tomorrow after spending the day preparing. He wants the confrontation to be dramatic. That gives us tonight to gather intelligence. I'll go, Sarah volunteered. I'm the best at stealth work, and my marks are more stable than most. I can get close without triggering alarms. Take Peters with you, Elena suggested. If something goes wrong, you'll need someone who can ride back and warn us fast. Sarah nodded agreement, and within the hour she and the deputy were riding south toward the mission ruins. The rest of them continued planning, working through scenarios and contingencies. Rowan was quiet through most of it, his face drawn with tension Elena recognized as guilt trying to assert itself. When the others dispersed to prepare weapons and supplies, Elena pulled Rowan aside. Talk to me, she said. What are you thinking? That I should do what he wants, Rowan admitted quietly. Just go. Surrender. Let him complete whatever ritual he has planned. If it kills me, at least everyone else stays safe. If it doesn't, maybe I'd finally be free of these marks. Or maybe you'd become something worse, Elena countered. Rowan, Castellan doesn't want to free you. He wants to control you. Whatever ritual he's planning, it won't give you peace. It'll just trade one prison for another. But Warren would live. You would be safe. Would I? Elena challenged. You think if Castellan gets what he wants from you, he'll just ignore the fact that there are 3 other marked vessels here? That he'll let Sarah and James and Catherine walk away? No, Rowan. Your surrender won't protect anyone. It'll just make us weaker when he comes for the rest of us. Rowan closed his eyes, pain written across every line of his face. I'm so tired of people being in danger because of what I am. Then stop thinking of yourself as the danger, Elena said firmly, taking his face in her hands. You're not what's dangerous here. Castellan is. The sect is. They're the ones who created this situation. You're just trying to survive it, and there's no shame in that. But survival doesn't mean surrender. It means fighting back. What if I'm not strong enough? Then we'll be strong together, Elena said. That's what love means, Rowan. We don't face the darkness alone. We face it together, and we trust that together we're stronger than we are apart. Rowan pulled her close, holding her with the desperate intensity of a man trying to memorize how it felt to be loved. If something happens to me tomorrow, nothing's going to happen to you, Elena interrupted, because I won't allow it. We've come too far and fought too hard to lose each other now. Sarah returned near midnight with valuable intelligence. The mission ruins were indeed prepared for ritual. She'd found chalk circles, candles positioned in specific patterns, and what looked like an altar stone in the center of the main chapel. More concerning, there were iron chains attached to the altar, sized appropriately for securing a person. Marshal Warren was being held in a cellar beneath the mission, guarded by two armed men who looked competent and alert. Castellan's not there yet, Sarah confirmed, but his preparations are thorough. Whatever he's planning requires significant setup, and he's clearly confident enough in his wards to leave the site unguarded overnight. That's arrogant, Catherine observed. And arrogance is a weakness we can exploit. They refined their plan through the early morning hours. The marked ones would approach from different directions, using their powers in concert to overwhelm Castellan's defenses. The deputies would extract Warren from the cellar while the confrontation happened in the chapel, getting him clear before things turned violent. Elena would stay back with Marcus, who was the weakest in direct combat but strongest in understanding the ritual magic. If he could disrupt Castellan's preparations, it might give the others the opening they needed. "I don't like you being anywhere near this," Rowan told Elena as dawn broke and they prepared to ride out. "I don't like you risking your life against a madman who thinks he owns you," Elena replied. "But here we are. We do what needs doing, Rowan. That's what partnership means." The ride to San Felipe mission took most of the day, giving them time to get into position before sunset. Elena and Marcus concealed themselves in the ruins of an old storage building that offered a clear view of the chapel while providing cover. The deputies circled around to approach the cellar from behind. Sarah, James, and Catherine spread out to form a triangle around the mission, close enough to support each other, but far enough apart that a single attack couldn't take all of them out simultaneously. Rowan positioned himself on the mission's front approach, clearly visible, the bait in the trap they were setting. The sun was touching the western horizon when Castellan arrived, and Elena's first thought was that he looked disappointingly normal. She'd expected a monster, someone whose evil was written plainly on their face. Instead, Castellan was a slender man of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of ascetic features that might have belonged to a monk or scholar. He wore simple traveling clothes and carried no visible weapons, which somehow made him more frightening rather than less. "Rowan Braddock," Castellan called out, his voice cultured and almost warm. "I'm pleased you came. I wasn't certain you would." "Where's Warren?" Rowan demanded, staying at the edge of the chapel's entrance. "Safe for the moment. He'll be released once you've submitted to completing the ritual. I'm not a monster, Rowan. I don't kill unnecessarily." "Just when it serves your purposes," Rowan said bitterly, "like the 4 others who didn't survive your marking ritual. Like all the people your sect has murdered in the name of whatever insanity you believe." Castellan's expression flickered with something that might have been regret. "Sacrifices in service of divine transformation," he said. "You of all people should understand. You've felt the power inside you, its magnificence, its potential. What I did to you was a gift, Rowan. I made you more than human. Why do you persist in seeing it as a curse?" "Because it was forced on me," Rowan said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "Because you carved those marks into my flesh while I screamed and begged you to stop. Because you murdered my friends and bound me to power I never wanted. That's not a gift, Castellan. That's torture dressed up in religious nonsense." "You lack vision," Castellan said, almost sadly. "But that will change. Once the ritual is complete, once the elemental gods fully manifest through you, you'll understand. You'll thank me for elevating you beyond the limitations of mortality." "I'll die first," Rowan said flatly. "That's certainly possible," Castellan acknowledged. "The completion ritual has a 60% fatality rate. But if you survive, you'll become something magnificent, a true vessel for divine power, not this half-finished thing you currently are. Isn't that worth the risk?" "Not even slightly," Rowan replied. "And I'm not here to surrender. I'm here to end you." Castellan's expression hardened. "Then you've doomed Marshal Warren and proven yourself a fool. I'd hoped for willing cooperation, but I can work with unconscious just as easily." He made a gesture with his left hand, and the air around Rowan suddenly compressed like an invisible vice. Elena watched in horror as Rowan dropped to his knees, gasping for breath as Castellan's power crushed down on him. But before Castellan could complete whatever attack he'd begun, Sarah struck from her concealed position. Lightning, actual lightning, drawn down from the clear sky above, cracked into the ground between Castellan and Rowan, breaking his concentration. The old man stumbled back, his face registering shock that quickly transformed into rage. "You brought them," he snarled, scanning the ruins for threats. "You brought the other marked ones. Foolish boy. Do you really think your weeks of practice are any match for my decades of mastery?" "Let's find out," Catherine said, emerging from behind a crumbling wall. Her marks blazed with silver fire as she thrust both hands forward, and a wave of concussive force slammed into Castellan, hard enough to knock him off his feet. But the old ritualist recovered with inhuman speed, rolling to his feet and raising his own hands. The chalk circles around the chapel began to glow, and Elena realized with horror that Castellan had prepared more than just a ritual space. He'd created a combat arena specifically designed to enhance his own power while limiting his opponents. "You're standing in a trap," Castellan said with grim satisfaction as the glowing circles activated. "Every mark you bear is connected to rituals I performed. Did you really think you could raise your hands against your creator?" The four marked vessels suddenly cried out in unison as their own power turned against them. The silver marks on their bodies blazed painfully bright, and Elena could see them struggling to maintain control as Castellan's prepared magic forced their internal energy into chaos. It was the same loss of control Rowan experienced during storms, but weaponized and directed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerability. "This is where it ends," Castellan declared, walking toward where Rowan had collapsed, still struggling against the power being forced through his body. "I'll take you back to my sanctum, complete what I started, and then hunt down these other wayward vessels one by one. You've forced my hand, Rowan. I would have been gentle with you. Now I'll simply be thorough." But Castellan had made a fatal error in his planning. He'd prepared for marked vessels. He'd trapped Rowan, Sarah, James, and Catherine in a magical snare that turned their own power against them. What he hadn't prepared for was 4 armed deputies who didn't bear any marks at all, and who had absolutely no patience for cult leaders who kidnapped federal marshals. Peters and his fellow deputies emerged from the cellar with Warren between them, bruised but alive, and they opened fire on Castellan with no hesitation and no mercy. The old man's protective wards stopped the first volley of bullets, but the effort of maintaining both the wards and the power controlling the marked vessels was clearly straining him. His concentration fractured, and Elena saw the glowing circles flicker. That momentary weakness was all Marcus needed. He'd been studying the ritual circles while Castellan was distracted, and now he moved with surprising speed for someone who'd been so quiet throughout. From his position, he kicked dust across 3 of the chalk circles, breaking their geometric integrity. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The prepared magic destabilized like a house of cards collapsing, and suddenly the marked vessels were free. Rowan surged to his feet, his eyes blazing with silver light and 6 years of suppressed rage. "You want to see what your gift can do, Castellan?" he roared. "Let me show you." What happened next would be talked about in Fort Winter for generations, though the details would become increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. The truth was remarkable enough. Rowan Braddock, supported by 3 other marked vessels who'd learned to control their power, turned the energy that had been forced into them against the man who'd put it there. They didn't kill him with fire or lightning or any of the dramatic violence that legends would later claim. Instead, they did something more fitting. Working in concert, their powers synchronized in ways Castellan had never intended, they wove a cage of pure force around the old ritualist. It was invisible to normal eyes, but impenetrable as iron, containing him in a sphere of compressed air and directed energy that nullified his own magic while preventing any physical escape. Castellan raged and struggled and tried desperately to counter what they'd done. But he was one man, powerful, yes, but ultimately just one man, against 4 who'd learned to turn his greatest achievement against him. "You wanted to make us into vessels for gods," Sarah said, her voice cold and hard. "Instead, you just made us into people who finally learned to work together. That's the problem with treating humans like objects, Castellan. Eventually, we remind you that we're not." Marshal Warren, nursing a bruised jaw but otherwise functional, approached the imprisoned ritualist with handcuffs ready. "Castellan, you're under arrest for kidnapping a federal officer, murder, conspiracy, and probably a dozen other charges we'll figure out once we get you somewhere with actual laws. You have the right to shut up, which I strongly encourage you to exercise." The deputies secured Castellan, the iron handcuffs causing him visible pain, but no longer able to trigger the kind of reaction they'd caused Rowan, and began the process of searching the mission for evidence. What they found in the cellar beneath the chapel would eventually lead to the prosecution of 17 people connected to the sect and the rescue of 6 individuals who'd been held captive for various horrific purposes. But in that moment, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the mission ruins fell into shadow, Elena ran to Rowan and threw her arms around him. He caught her and held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. "It's over," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's finally over." "Not quite," Rowan replied, but his voice held something she'd never heard before. Hope. Real and substantial. Not just the desperate kind, but the kind that believed in actual futures. Castellan's captured, but his knowledge isn't gone. Marcus thinks he can use the man's notes to develop a ritual that might stabilize our marks permanently, remove the worst of the side effects without killing us. It could take years of research, but it's possible. "Then we have years," Elena said firmly. "We have time, we have each other, and we have a home to go back to. That's more than either of us had 6 months ago." They rode back to Braddock Ranch in the early morning hours, exhausted but victorious. Marshal Warren, suffering a concussion and various bruises but in decent spirits considering, rode with them. The deputies had stayed behind to secure the mission and wait for additional law enforcement to arrive. But Warren had insisted on accompanying Rowan's group back personally. "I owe you folks an apology," the marshal said, as they rode through the pre-dawn darkness. "When I first came to arrest you, Braddock, I thought I was dealing with a murderer who'd gotten away with it for too long. Turns out I was dealing with victims trying to survive. I should have seen that sooner." "You saw it when it mattered," Rowan replied. "That's what counts." "Still, I misjudged the situation badly, and I owe my life to you and your friends being willing to risk yourselves for someone who'd come to take you into custody. That's not something I'll forget." The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun rose, and Elena felt something in her chest ease at the sight of home. That's what it had become over these months, not just shelter or safety, but genuinely home. A place where love had grown in the spaces between fear and hope, where 2 desperately lonely people had found each other and built something worth protecting. Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Sarah, James, Catherine, and Marcus stayed at the ranch while they planned their next moves. Marcus spent long hours translating Castellan's captured notes, searching for the ritual that might stabilize the marks permanently. Catherine trained the others in combat applications of their powers, determined that they'd never be vulnerable the way they'd been before. Sarah and James talked about establishing a permanent sanctuary for marked individuals, a place where they could live without fear of discovery or persecution. And Rowan and Elena simply lived day by day, learning to be married in all the ways their practical arrangement had never quite allowed for. They moved Rowan's belongings into the main house, ending his exile to the barn. They worked the ranch together, Elena learning to manage cattle, while Rowan learned to accept help without guilt. They talked late into the night about dreams and fears and the future they were building together. 3 months after Castellan's capture, on a morning when autumn was just beginning to paint the edges of Texas gold, Elena woke feeling ill. She dismissed it as something she'd eaten, but when the nausea continued for a week, a terrible and wonderful possibility occurred to her. She rode into town alone, spoke quietly with Mrs. Hendricks, who'd first warned her about the mysterious Mr. Braddock, and returned to the ranch with confirmation of what she'd suspected. She was pregnant. The impossibility of it took her breath away. Rowan had believed his marks made him sterile, that the power inside him had burned away any possibility of fatherhood. But somehow, miraculously, life had found a way. She carried the news like a secret treasure for 2 days, trying to find the right moment to tell him. The moment chose itself. They were sitting on the porch at sunset, Rowan's arm around her shoulders, watching the sky paint itself in shades of orange and purple. The marks on his arms were visible, his sleeves rolled up now that he no longer felt the need to hide what he was. "Rowan," Elena said quietly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him go very still. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," she said simply. "About 2 months along, Mrs. Hendricks thinks." For a long moment, Rowan just stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, wonder, and fear in rapid succession. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The power, I thought—" "Apparently the power doesn't prevent everything," Elena said, smiling through sudden tears. "We're going to have a baby, Rowan. A child. Our child." Rowan's hands went to her stomach, pressing gently against the place where new life was growing, and Elena saw silver light flicker beneath his palms, not hurting, just responding to the profound emotion flooding through him. "What if the marks transfer?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What if I've cursed our child the way I was cursed?" "Then we'll love them anyway," Elena said firmly. "We'll teach them control the way you've learned. We'll give them family and support and everything you didn't have when you were forced to carry this alone. But Rowan, we don't know that the marks will transfer. Maybe they won't. Maybe our child will be born completely normal, without any of this power." "Or maybe," Sarah's voice said from the doorway, she'd clearly been eavesdropping, "your child will be born with marks, but without pain. Born adapted to the power instead of having it forced in. That's Marcus's theory anyway. That children conceived after the marks have fully integrated might carry the power naturally, like an inheritance instead of a curse." Rowan looked up at Sarah, then at Elena, then back down at where his hands rested on her stomach. Slowly, wonderingly, he smiled, a real smile, full of joy and hope, and something that looked like the beginning of healing. "A baby," he said, testing the word. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Elena confirmed. "Are you ready for that?" Rowan laughed, the sound bright and genuine and free of the darkness that had shadowed it for so long. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for something this momentous. But with you? Yes. I'm ready to try." The pregnancy progressed normally despite everyone's concerns. Marcus monitored Elena carefully, using his research to check for any signs that the marks were affecting the developing child. What he found was unexpected: faint silver tracings along the baby's developing spine, visible only when Elena was in bright sunlight or when Rowan touched her stomach. The child was marked, but differently than the adults had been. More integrated, more natural, as if the power was part of their fundamental design rather than an addition forced into unwilling flesh. "This could change everything," Marcus said, his voice awed as he showed them his drawings of what he'd observed. "If your child is born healthy and marked, it means the power can be inherited naturally. It means the next generation won't have to suffer the way we did. They'll just be." "They'll still have to learn control," Catherine pointed out. "Having the power naturally doesn't mean automatically knowing how to use it safely." "No," Rowan agreed, "but they'll have us to teach them. They'll have family who understand, who can guide them. They'll never have to be alone with this the way I was." Elena gave birth on a spring morning when the air smelled of wildflowers and new grass, when the ranch was alive with the sounds of calves being born and birds building nests. The labor was long and difficult, but Sarah and Mrs. Hendricks attended her while Rowan paced outside, too nervous to stay still and too devoted to go far. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Rowan burst through the door to find Elena exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "It's a boy," she said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. "A healthy, perfect boy." Rowan approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Elena pulled back the blanket to show him their son, he made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. The baby was red and wrinkled and beautiful, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving at the world. And there, along his tiny spine and shoulders, were faint silver marks, delicate and beautiful, like someone had painted him with starlight. "Adam," Rowan said, the name they'd chosen together. "Adam Braddock." He held his son for the first time with shaking hands, marveling at how small and fragile and perfect he was. The marks on Adam's skin glowed faintly in response to his father's touch. But there was no pain, no burning, just connection. The child was marked but not cursed, powerful but not dangerous. He was something entirely new, the first naturally marked vessel, born of love rather than torture, carrying power that was his birthright rather than his prison. Over the following months, the ranch transformed into something no one could have predicted. Marcus established a research center in one of the outbuildings, bringing in scholars and healers who could be trusted with the truth about the marks. Catherine built a training facility where marked individuals could learn control and safety. Sarah and James created a network that helped locate and rescue others who'd been taken by remaining sect members or who'd been marked and abandoned to survive alone. And Rowan, Elena, and baby Adam became the heart of it all, proof that marked individuals could build real lives, have families, find happiness despite the darkness in their past. Visitors came from across the territory and beyond, some seeking help, others offering knowledge. The ranch that had once been a place of isolation became a sanctuary for people learning to reclaim their humanity from those who'd tried to steal it. Adam grew strong and healthy, his marks visible but stable, his power manifesting in small, controllable ways as he developed. At 6 months old, he could make small objects float when he laughed. At a year, he could create tiny breezes when he was excited. But unlike his father's power, Adam's was joyful, something that brought delight rather than fear, connection rather than isolation. "He's going to be extraordinary," Marcus said one evening, watching toddler Adam make flower petals dance in the air for his mother's entertainment. Not despite the marks, but because of them. Because he was born to parents who love him, raised by a community that understands him. He's everything we wish we'd had. He's everything we're going to make sure every marked child has from now on, Rowan corrected. No more victims. No more prisoners of power we didn't choose. Just people learning to be extraordinary in their own ways. Elena watched her husband play with their son, watched silver light dance between them as their marks responded to each other in harmony rather than conflict, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She'd come to this ranch desperate and alone, answering a marriage notice from a man no one else dared approach. She'd expected survival at best, misery at worst. Instead, she'd found love, messy and complicated and absolutely real. She'd found purpose in helping build something that mattered. She'd found family among people who'd been marked by darkness, but who chose every day to walk toward light. The cowboy nobody had dared to touch was now a man surrounded by people who loved him, leading a community of survivors turned into something powerful and purposeful. The marks that had once been his prison had become his mission, not to escape them, but to help others understand that being marked didn't mean being cursed. That power forced upon you didn't have to define you, that even the darkest beginnings could lead to beautiful endings if you found the courage to keep living, keep hoping, keep choosing love over fear. As the sun set over Braddock Ranch, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and purple, Elena Braddock held her marked son and stood beside her marked husband and looked out over land filled with marked people learning to be free. And she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice that desperate day when she'd answered an impossible notice and married a man wrapped in mystery. Sometimes the most terrifying leaps of faith led to the most extraordinary destinations. Sometimes the people everyone else feared were exactly the people who understood what it meant to be brave. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really could transform curses into blessings, isolation into community, and fear into hope that blazed as bright as silver marks glowing in the gathering dark. The end.